Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a decade that looked like a chemistry set exploded inside a shopping mall. A decade where shoulder pads made every accountant look ready for a linebacker tryout, where hairspray had its own weather system, and where an entire generation decided that if a colour existed, it belonged on a jacket. Sometimes several colours, sometimes on the same jacket. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who enjoys drifting off to gentle chaos and questionable fashion choices, feel free to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. No pressure, I'm not your guidance counsellor. And leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is for you, because it's always strangely comforting to know someone in a different time zone is also lying very still in the dark, listening to a story about parachute pants. Now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe click on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background. Get yourself tucked in, comfortable, heavy-eyed, the whole production, because tonight we're going somewhere loud, somewhere sticky with hairspray, somewhere that smells faintly of Aquanet and cinnamon pretzels. Before we go there, let's just sit with a few questions. Why did an entire society agree that pants should sound like a windbreaker having an argument with itself? Why did otherwise reasonable adults decide their shoulders needed to be wider than their doorways? Why was a plastic watch considered a personality? Why did teenagers pay actual money to look like they'd been dipped in bleach and hung out to dry? And 40 years later, why is your niece wearing the exact same jacket you wore to your 8th grade dance? Unironically, and somehow making it look cooler than you ever did. We'll get to all of it. Slowly, sleepily, no judgment. Mostly, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1985. The air smells like hairspray and Cinnabon. Somewhere a television is playing MTV, actual music videos, back when that was the whole channel. A boombox the size of a suitcase is somehow still going on someone's shoulder. Your local mall has just opened its doors for the day, its fountains gurgling, its neon signs humming, its food court prepping 400 variations of a pretzel. Everyone around you is dressed like they lost a bet with a highlighter. And somehow none of them know yet that in about 40 years their grandchildren are going to buy this exact outfit at a thrift store and call it vintage. Let's find out how we got here. You walk into an office in 1985 and every silhouette looks like it's bracing for a football tackle. Shoulder pads had crept out of sportswear and into blazers, blouses, even nightgowns, until the average department store looked like a costume shop for a very confident linebacker convention. Designers said it was about power dressing, about women taking up space in a world that hadn't made room for them yet. It worked, mostly though getting through a revolving door required the spatial awareness of a school bus driver. Before shoulder pads took over Main Street, they had already had a long and complicated career in military uniforms, tailored to widen a soldier's frame and project authority from several yards away. By the early 80s, fashion designers had quietly borrowed the same trick and pointed it at corporate America. If broad shoulders read as commanding on a general, the thinking went, they could read as commanding on a woman walking into a boardroom full of men who assumed she was there to bring the coffee. So the pads got bigger, and bigger, until a simple blazer needed its own zip code. You could trace a lot of this back to television actually, because nothing sells a fashion trend faster than watching it strut across a hit show once a week. Dynasty and Dallas put women in shoulder pads the size of throw pillows, gliding through mansions and boardrooms with enough structural reinforcement to survive a minor earthquake. Joan Collins as Alexis Carrington did not just wear a suit, she wore architecture, and by Monday morning half the women in your office wanted the same silhouette, minus the mansion and the scheming. There was an actual philosophy behind all of it too, borrowed from a best-selling book that told women dressing for success meant dressing to look as unmistakably authoritative as the men already running the place. If a man's suit jacket implied broad shoulders and quiet dominance, then a woman's blazer would simply borrow the same implication, foam and all. It was not subtle. Subtlety was not really on the table in 1985. You did not tiptoe into a meeting, you arrived like a delivery truck. Feel the actual pads for a second, because they were not glamorous up close. Crescent-shaped wedges of foam or stitched cotton batting sewn directly into the lining of a jacket, or, if you were being efficient about it, attached with a strip of Velcro so you could rip them out before washing and swap them between garments like a set of tools. You would reach into a drawer and find a small pile of shoulder pads sitting there, disconnected from any actual clothing, looking vaguely like hockey equipment for a very small athlete. Sewing shops sold pad kits by the pair, in a range of thicknesses, so you could custom build your own silhouette depending on how much authority you needed that particular Tuesday. And the sound. Nobody talks about the sound. A room full of women in heavily padded blazers moving at once produced a very specific rustle, fabric shifting over foam, structured shoulders bumping gently against door frames, against each other in crowded elevators, against anything within about 4 inches of where a normal shoulder would have ended. You learned to navigate hallways sideways. You learned that hugging a colleague required a kind of careful geometry, angling in at just the right point so 2 sets of foam wedges did not collide like bumper cars at a fair. Doorways became a genuine hazard. Revolving doors, specifically, turned into a small daily test of your spatial reasoning, because you had exactly 1 shot to time your entrance before your own shoulders wedged you against the glass like a couch that would not fit around a stairwell corner. You would see people pause, recalculate, and go again, the way a moving truck backs up and tries a driveway a second time. Nobody found this odd. Everybody was doing it. The truly ambitious offices had women whose shoulder pads seemed to have shoulder pads of their own, jackets so structured they could stand upright on a chair without a human being anywhere near them, holding their shape like a knight's breastplate left out to dry. You would walk past an empty desk chair at lunchtime and briefly mistake the blazer draped over it for someone still sitting there, silently judging your spreadsheet. Men got pulled into the arms race too, though with slightly less enthusiasm. Suit jackets for guys widened out as well, less as a political statement, and more because if everyone else in the room looked like they had bench-pressed a car that morning, standing next to them in a soft, unstructured shoulder made you look like you had wandered in from a nap. So the pads crept into menswear, quietly, defensively, the sartorial equivalent of buying a slightly bigger truck than your neighbours. None of this made ordinary daily life easier. Car seat belts, designed for shoulders of ordinary width, now had to stretch and twist around a foam ledge that had not existed the model year before, and buckling in for a commute occasionally felt like wrestling a seatbelt that had personally decided you did not belong in that car. Grocery store aisles, narrow enough already, became a genuine test of trust between 2 shoulder-padded shoppers passing in opposite directions, one of you inevitably turning sideways like a crab to let the other through without a foam collision. Designers like Claude Montana and Thierry Mugler leaned into the exaggeration on purpose, sending models down runways in jackets so wide at the shoulder and so narrow at the waist that the whole shape resembled an inverted triangle, or, if you squinted, a very confident refrigerator. By the back half of the decade, the trend had wandered so far past the boardroom that it showed up in nightgowns, of all things structured shoulders on a garment whose entire purpose was to be worn horizontally, unconscious, by no one who needed to project authority to anyone. Somewhere a night owl went to bed dressed for a hostile takeover. It is hard to imagine what threat, exactly, a shoulder-padded nightgown was meant to project, unless the fear was burglars judging your posture while you slept. What is genuinely remarkable, lying here now, blankets soft, shoulders blissfully unreinforced, is how quickly an entire decade agreed that wider was better, that a jacket should announce your presence in a room before you actually said anything. It was not about comfort. Comfort had nothing to do with it. It was about silhouette as strategy, about walking into a meeting already looking like the answer was going to be no, whether or not you had made up your mind yet. And then, as these things do, it ended almost as fast as it started. By the early 90s, the pads shrank, the blazers softened, and an entire generation quietly retired their foam wedges to the backs of closets, where some of them, frankly, are probably still sitting today, patiently waiting for someone to need a very specific, very structural throw pillow, which, if you think about it, is really all a shoulder pad was ever trying to be. Somewhere in America right now, a single can of Aquanet is holding up a hairstyle taller than the person wearing it. The 80s turned hair into architecture, teased, crimped, and locked into place with enough aerosol to be visible from a weather satellite. Hairdressers weren't stylists anymore, they were structural engineers, and the smell, sweet, chemical, faintly dangerous, still lingers in the memory of anyone who ever sat still for 2 hours under a blow-dryer the size of a hood ornament. There is a saying that got passed around plenty back then, credited depending on who you ask to a certain big-haired country singer, that the higher the hair, the closer to God. Nobody in 1985 treated this as a joke. They treated it as a design brief. Hair was not something you simply washed and left alone anymore. It was something you engineered from the roots up, floor by floor. The way you would construct a building you fully intended to defend against wind. The process started with rollers, hot ones plugged in and glowing on the bathroom counter, or the foam kind you slept in, waking up looking less like you had rested and more like you had been struck by lightning in a controlled, fashionable way. Then came teasing, or backcombing if you wanted the technical term, where you took a fine tooth comb and dragged it backward through sections of hair over and over until the strands knotted themselves into a dense, resilient cushion of volume. It looked, up close, like a bird's nest that had been given a corporate mandate, and it needed to, because everything that came after depended on that foundation holding its shape. Then the crimping iron, a genuinely strange invention that clamped flat, zigzag ridges into your hair, turning it into something that resembled a potato chip in texture, if potato chips had bangs. Crimped hair caught light in a way regular hair simply did not, which meant under the fluorescent buzz of a mall food court or the flashing lights of a school dance, your head essentially became a disco ball with feelings. And then, finally, the can. Aquanet was not the only hairspray on the market, but it was the one everyone's mother had under the bathroom sink, cheap, industrial, sold in a can wide enough to double as a doorstop, dispensing a fine chemical mist that could lock a hairstyle into place for the better part of a school day. You would hold your breath, close your eyes, and spray directly into the structure you had just spent 45 minutes building, coating it in a fine, sticky film that dried crunchy to the touch, the texture of a stale meringue balanced on top of your skull. Run a finger through finished 80s hair, and it genuinely crackled, like static electricity had opinions about your bangs. The smell deserves its own moment here, because it was not subtle. Sweet, floral, faintly like hospital disinfectant if hospital disinfectant had been marketed to teenagers, and it clung to bathrooms, school hallways, entire households for hours after application. Walk into any American home on a Saturday morning in 1986, and you could tell, purely by scent, that someone in that house was getting ready for something, a date, a dance, church. Did not matter. The ritual smelled the same, regardless of the occasion. Aquanet was not alone on the shelf. Either, competing brands with names like Rave and White Rain lined up beside it, each promising a slightly different hold, a slightly different scent, though to anyone standing in the aisle they all delivered roughly the same result, a sticky mist and a faint headache by the third can of the week. Some schools eventually restricted aerosol hairspray in the bathrooms altogether, not out of any grand environmental principle, but because the sheer volume being deployed before first period would set off fire alarms triggered by fine mist drifting into smoke detectors, an entire student body evacuated to the parking lot because too many people, simultaneously, wanted hair that touched the ceiling. Salons themselves became small industrial operations. Mall hair salons, tucked between a shoe store and a Cinnabon, ran blow dryers the size of small appliances, hooded contraptions you sat under for what felt like geological time, while a stylist worked through your hair section by section, teasing, spraying, teasing again, checking the structure the way an engineer checks a load-bearing wall. These were not quick trims. A proper big hair appointment could eat up an entire afternoon, and you would walk out afterward moving your head very carefully, like you were balancing a full glass of water on top of it. Because in a sense, you were, if that glass of water weighed 4 pounds and smelled like a chemical plant. Rock stars did not help matters, though they certainly enjoyed themselves. Hair metal bands built entire careers on hair that appeared to have its own agenda, teased and sprayed into towering, backlit silhouettes that looked less like haircuts and more like weather events. Posters of guys with bigger hair than any of the women in your class went up on bedroom walls across the country. And somewhere in there the message got delivered loud and clear that more was correct. That if your hair was not visible from the parking lot, you simply had not tried hard enough. There was a real cost to all this ambition, and it was not just time or money, though it was plenty of both. Aerosol hairspray in the early part of the decade still relied on chlorocarbon propellants. The same class of chemical scientists were increasingly linking to a shrinking ozone layer, which meant that somewhere above the mall, above the football field, above every school dance in America, a very literal hole in the sky was politely being nudged along by a generation's collective devotion to volume. Manufacturers phased out the CFCs by the mid-80s, switching to different propellants. Though the can itself never got any smaller, and neither, really, did the hair. Humidity was the sworn enemy of the entire enterprise. You could spend 2 hours building a hairstyle capable of surviving a hurricane, and then step outside into a single humid afternoon and watch weeks of practice technique collapse in real time, the crimped ridges softening, the teased volumes sagging. The whole architectural marvel slowly returning to sea level like a souffle that had heard bad news. A sudden rainstorm on prom night was not just inconvenient, it was a small personal tragedy, witnessed by everyone at the punch bowl. And yet, somehow, none of this deterred anyone. If anything, the fragility made the commitment more impressive. You did not just wear big hair, you defended it. All day, against wind, against rain, against gravity itself, armed with nothing but a travel-sized can of Aquanet, kept in your locker for emergency touch-ups between third and fourth period. Lying here now, hair loose against a pillow, no crunch, no crackle, no chemical cloud drifting from the bathroom down the hall, it is worth appreciating just how much quiet effort an entire generation once poured into looking taller from the neck up. They were not wrong that it made an impression. It is just that the impression, more often than not, was visible from space. You reach into your closet and pull out jeans that look like they survived a chemical spill, and technically, they did. Acid wash and stone wash denim were created by literally tumbling fabric with pumice stones, or bleach, until it looked bruised, faded, and lived in before you'd ever worn it once. Stiff enough to stand up on their own in a corner overnight, these jeans required a genuine physical negotiation just to sit down in. And somehow everyone agreed this was the look. Denim itself had been around for over a century by the time the 80s decided it needed some visual damage, but stonewashing as a deliberate technique only really caught on in the late 1970s, developed by an Italian company looking for a way to soften rigid indigo fabric without waiting the usual 6 months of actual wear. The solution was almost comically direct. Throw the jeans into enormous industrial washing machines alongside chunks of raw pumice, actual volcanic rock, and let the stones tumble against the fabric for hours, physically abrading the surface until it faded, softened, and picked up that mottled cloud-like pattern that redders instantly lived in. By the time American manufacturers picked up the technique in the early 80s, it had become a full production line. You would have found entire factory floors dedicated to nothing but stonewashing. Machines the size of delivery trucks, tumbling denim and pumice together with a low, grinding roar, more rock quarry than garment factory. Someone's actual job title involved monitoring rock-filled washing machines all day, which is either the most or least glamorous manufacturing role of the decade, depending on how you feel about geology. Acid wash took the concept a step further and got its bruised, blotchy look from soaking pumice stones in chlorine or bleach before tumbling them with the denim so the fabric faded unevenly. Streaked white and pale blue in a pattern that resembled, depending on who you asked, marble, storm clouds, or a Dalmatian that had gotten into a chemistry set. No two pairs looked quite the same, which manufacturers marketed as uniqueness, and which was really just a byproduct of bleach doing whatever bleach felt like doing that particular Tuesday. Not everyone waited for a factory to do the damage for them, either. A whole cottage industry sprang up around doing acid wash at home, soaking plain denim in a bathtub with diluted bleach, splattering it with a sponge, or twisting it into a tight knot secured with rubber bands before dunking it in a bucket, all in pursuit of that same blotchy. Marbled pattern the professionals achieved with actual volcanic rock. The results were unpredictable and occasionally disastrous. An uneven patch here, a hole burned clean through the knee there, and more than one bathroom carried a faint bleach smell for weeks afterward that no amount of air freshener could fully argue with. Parents were not always thrilled to discover their good jeans, or worse, someone else's borrowed jeans, soaking in the tub. But the results when they worked were indistinguishable from anything sold at the mall for triple the price. What nobody tells you about the finished product until you are standing in a fitting room wrestling with it yourself is that the stonewashing process did not just fade the colour, it stiffened the fabric into something closer to lightweight cardboard than actual cloth. New acid wash jeans could genuinely stand upright on their own, propped in the corner of a bedroom overnight like a scarecrow waiting for its owner. Getting into them was not a casual act, it was a small athletic event involving hopping, tugging, and a specific kind of determined breathing usually reserved for moving furniture. Sitting down came with its own sound effects. Stiff denim does not bend so much as crease violently, so every time you dropped into a chair you would hear a sharp crinkling crackle, less like fabric and more like someone crushing a cardboard box a few feet away. Walking produced a constant low rustle, jeans announcing your arrival down the school hallway a solid 2 seconds before you actually turned the corner. And forget stretching, forget kneeling, forget any movement not explicitly rehearsed in advance, because that fabric had opinions about flexibility, and the opinion was no. None of this stopped anyone from buying them by the pair, and then, for good measure, matching them. The acid wash jean jacket paired with acid wash jeans became such a common combination it earned itself a nickname. The Canadian tuxedo, an all-denim outfit that made you look less like a person getting dressed and more like a walking advertisement for a fabric mill. Denim showed up on vests, on skirts, on overalls with straps wide enough to double as luggage handles, on baseball caps, even on handbags, an entire wardrobe built from the same stiff, faded, volcanic rock-abraded material layered on top of itself without a hint of irony. Brands fought hard over this particular battlefield. Jordache, Guess, Zed Cavaricci, and a dozen others slapped their names across back pockets and convinced an entire generation that the specific pattern of fading on your backside said something meaningful about your taste, your income, and possibly your future. A pair of designer acid wash jeans could run you 3 or 4 times what a plain pair cost. For jeans that had been deliberately damaged before you ever put them on, which, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, is a genuinely strange thing to pay extra for. And yet, decades later, boutique labels would sell pre-ripped, pre-faded denim for well over $200 a pair and call it directional, so maybe nobody in 1985 was as foolish as they looked. There was, underneath all the fashion, an actual manufacturing cost to this look that most shoppers never thought about. Grinding pumice against fabric for hours wore down washing machines fast, and factory workers spent long shifts around fine stone dust and bleach fumes. An occupational reality considerably less glamorous than the finished jeans folded neatly on a department store shelf. Some manufacturers later moved towards sandblasting denim instead of stones, a technique eventually restricted in several countries once it became clear that breathing in that much fine particulate matter all day was doing real damage to the people doing the abrading. The jeans looked effortless. They were not effortless. Someone, somewhere, worked very hard to make your pants look like they had already been in a fight. By the end of the decade, the trend had softened, quite literally, as manufacturers found gentler ways to distress fabric and consumers moved on to darker, less dramatic washes. But for a solid stretch of the 80s, an entire population agreed that the ideal pair of jeans should look like it had already lived a rough, adventurous life, cracked, bleached and beaten by actual rocks, before you had so much as walked to the mailbox in it. Lying here now in something soft, something that never once required a wrestling match to put on. It is worth appreciating that your pyjamas did not spend the afternoon tumbling with volcanic debris. They were just born comfortable. Nobody had to hit them with bleach and a rock to get there. You slide into a pair of parachute pants, and immediately your legs make a sound like a tent being folded in a hurricane, made from thin, shiny nylon with a dozen unnecessary zippers. These pants were less about function and more about the swish, that unmistakable rustle that announced your arrival before you even entered the room. Breakdancers loved them for the way they moved. Everyone else loved them, because MC Hammer made them look like a superpower. The fabric itself came straight from military and skydiving equipment, a lightweight, ultra-durable nylon called ripstop, woven with a reinforced grid pattern originally designed to keep an actual parachute from tearing apart at 13,000 feet. Somewhere along the way, someone looked at bolts of this shiny, wind-resistant material sitting in a factory and thought, forget the sky. Put this on legs. The name stuck for a reason. These pants genuinely were made from the same stuff that kept people alive after jumping out of airplanes, which feels like either an enormous compliment to the pants or a slightly concerning statement about air travel safety in general. The look started, appropriately enough, on the street rather than the runway. Adopted early by breakdancing crews in New York, who needed something that could slide, spin and windmill across linoleum and flattened cardboard without catching or tearing. Regular denim dragged against the floor and slowed you down mid-spin. Ripstop nylon, by contrast, practically glided, low friction, lightweight, forgiving of a body twisting itself into shapes gravity generally objects to. For a head spin or a backspin, the fabric was not a style choice. It was equipment, no different from a runner choosing the right shoe. Then the zippers arrived, and kept arriving. A proper pair of parachute pants could carry anywhere from 6 to a dozen zippers, scattered across the thighs, the calves, the ankles, some connected to actual pockets. Plenty connected to absolutely nothing, purely decorative hardware whose only function was to catch light and make a small metallic clink with every step. You would zip and unzip them out of pure nervous habit, the way someone today might click a pen, except your pen made you look like you were preparing to skydive out of a moving school bus. The ankles were where the real engineering happened. Parachute pants tapered sharply at the bottom, cinched tight around the ankle either with a zipper, an elastic band, or both, so that the excess volume of fabric bunched dramatically at the thigh and hip before narrowing to almost nothing at the foot. The overall silhouette made your legs look like two windsocks that had given up halfway through inflating. It was a strange shape by any objective measure, and yet on a dance floor mid-spin, That same silhouette billowed and snapped with real visual drama, catching air and light in a way that regular trousers simply could not compete with. And then, of course, the sound. Nylon rubbing against nylon with every single step produced a distinct rhythmic swish, sharp, synthetic, unmistakable. The kind of noise that today gets its own dedicated corner of the internet from people who find crinkling sounds oddly soothing. In 1985, nobody found it soothing so much as inevitable. You could not sneak anywhere in parachute pants. Walking down a quiet school hallway in a pair announced your presence like a marching band, a full room ahead of your actual arrival. And sitting still in a movie theatre seat produced enough rustling with every shift of weight that entire rows of moviegoers developed a specific silent resentment toward whoever wore them to the evening showing. Comfort, predictably, took a back seat to spectacle. Nylon does not breathe, which meant an afternoon of actual dancing in parachute pants turned into a small sauna experience below the waist, sweat with nowhere useful to go, clinging fabric, and the occasional static shock sharp enough to make you flinch reaching for a metal door handle after an hour on a dry gym floor. Gym class became a minor hazard course. Kids sliding unexpectedly across waxed floors in shoes that gripped fine but pants that had entirely different plans. Arms windmilling for balance in a way that, ironically, looked a lot like the dance moves the pants were designed for in the first place. No single figure did more for the pants' mainstream reputation than MC Hammer, whose massively exaggerated, wildly baggy version, cinched tight at the ankle and billowing out to something resembling a hot air balloon at the hip, became inseparable from his stage performances by the end of the decade. Watching him move in them, sliding, spinning, kicking with a fluidity that seemed to defy how much fabric was actually involved, convinced an entire generation of kids that the right pants alone might grant them similar powers. It did not. Most kids who tried recreating his moves in their own bedroom mainly succeeded in tripping over several unnecessary zippers and knocking a lamp off a dresser. Getting a pair in the first place was not always simple, either. Parachute pants commanded a real premium at the mall, enough that plenty of kids spent weeks angling and negotiating with parents who took one look at the price tag, then at the pants themselves, and asked, entirely reasonably, why a pair of trousers needed that many zippers in the first place. Catalogue pages from department stores devoted whole spreads to variations on the theme, and rival performers besides Hammer, breakdancing crews on street corners, early rap acts on late-night television, kept the look in constant rotation, each adding their own combination of extra pockets, elastic gathers, or reflective piping, until it became difficult to find two pairs in a single school hallway that matched exactly. Retailers, sensing opportunity, ran with colour combinations that had no business existing anywhere near each other. Metallic silver paired with hot pink, black panelled with electric blue, patterns that looked less like clothing and more like the packaging for a video game console that had not been invented yet. Parachute pants came in every finish from matte to borderline reflective, and under gymnasium fluorescent lighting or the strobing lights of a school dance, a room full of them created a kind of low-grade visual chaos, shifting, shimmering, swishing in unison like a flock of birds that had all, somehow, agreed on the same terrible fashion choice. By the early 90s, the trend deflated about as quickly as it had inflated, nylon giving way to looser, softer materials, and parachute pants retreated mostly into novelty costume territory, a reliable Halloween choice for anyone doing an 80s theme with minimal effort. But for a few loud, swishing years, an entire culture agreed that pants should move like they had somewhere important to be, sound like a small storm rolling through the room, and, if at all possible, make you feel briefly, gloriously, like you might be able to spin on your head in the school cafeteria. Lying here now in something quiet, something that makes no sound whatsoever when you shift under the covers, take a moment to appreciate the stillness. No swish. no zippers catching on the sheets, no small electric shock waiting for you at the nightstand lamp, just soft fabric, doing absolutely nothing dramatic, exactly the way pyjamas are supposed to behave. You open your closet in 1987 and it practically requires sunglasses. Neon pink, electric green and radioactive yellow weren't accent colours, they were entire outfits, often worn together in combinations that would make a traffic cone blush. Colour blocking meant wearing 3 or 4 of these tones at once, with zero regard for whether the human eye could process it. It was loud, it was proud, and it worked because subtlety simply hadn't been invented yet. Fluorescent dye itself was not new. Chemists had been producing genuinely eye-searing colours since the 1930s, but for decades those dyes stayed mostly confined to safety equipment. Life vests, highway cones, the vests worn by road crews who needed to be visible to drivers half a mile away in the rain. Somewhere in the early 80s, textile manufacturers figured out how to apply that same aggressive brightness to ordinary clothing without it fading into dullness after a single wash. And the moment that technology hit department stores, an entire decade decided safety vest visibility was actually a desirable personal aesthetic. You did not want to blend into a crowd anymore. You wanted a passing aeroplane to be able to spot you. Skate and surf culture out of California got there early. Brands built around the beach lifestyle slapping neon panels across board shorts, windbreakers and wetsuits. Partly because bright colours genuinely helped surfers spot each other bobbing in open water. And partly because it simply looked electric against tanned skin and blue ocean. The kind of contrast that photographed well for a growing surf magazine industry. That beachy neon energy migrated inland fast, showing up on windbreakers and sweatshirts in landlocked shopping malls 1,000 miles from the nearest wave, worn by kids who had never once stood on a surfboard, but very much wanted you to think otherwise. Ski slopes did their own version of the same thing, and if you really want a vivid mental picture of peak 80s neon, picture an entire mountainside of skiers in one-piece suits, coloured like a highlighter factory explosion, hot pink and lime green and electric blue zigzagging down white snow, in patterns that made them look less like athletes and more like a bag of candy that had achieved sentience, and taken up winter sports. The bright colours served an actual practical purpose here too, made a fallen skier easier to spot against snow, though it is fair to say the fashion enthusiasm outpaced the safety justification by a wide margin. The real chaos, though, came from colour blocking, the deliberate decision to take 3 or 4 of these already loud tones and wear them simultaneously, in large geometric panels, with no attempt at harmony whatsoever. A single sweatshirt might feature blocks of hot pink, electric yellow and turquoise stitched together like a quilt designed by committee, and you would pair that with leggings in yet another clashing tone, plus a windbreaker in a 5th, because if a little neon was good. Several unrelated neons worn at once was apparently spectacular. Certain brands built entire identities around exactly this look, sweatshirts and separates in bold primary blocks that could be mixed and matched in nearly infinite, uniformly aggressive combinations. Fashion logic briefly stopped asking whether colours complemented each other, and started asking only whether they were all, individually, bright enough. Then, near the tail end of the decade, someone took the whole concept a step further and made the colour unstable on purpose. Heat-sensitive dye, marketed under a brand most people simply called hypercolour, shifted shade in response to body warmth, so a shirt might start out deep purple and bloom into hot pink wherever you pressed a hand against it, under an armpit, across the back after a bus ride on a hot afternoon. It was neon with a party trick, colour blocking that redrew itself in real time, depending on where you had just been sweating, which sounds faintly unhygienic described out loud decades later, and was in fact exactly that, though nobody seemed to mind at the time. Gym class turned every hypercolour shirt into a slow-motion heat map of the day's physical effort, and somehow that counted as a selling point. Touch these fabrics and you would find two very different textures depending on the garment. The slick, cool nylon of a windbreaker that rustled the same swishy way as everything else made from synthetic fibre that decade, or the soft, slightly fuzzy pile of a fleece sweatshirt, both equally saturated in colour regardless of material. Wash them enough times and, unlike a lot of 80s fashion, the neon actually held up reasonably well. The fluorescent dyes were stubborn, resistant to fading in a way that regular dyes were not, so you could genuinely wear the same radioactive green windbreaker for years without it dulling into something more socially acceptable. And then there was the blacklight, the single greatest unplanned bonus of the whole trend. Roller rinks and arcades across the country ran black lights as standard house lighting, and fluorescent clothing, it turned out, reacted to ultraviolet light by glowing, genuinely glowing, an eerie, vivid brightness that regular colours simply could not produce. Step onto a roller rink floor in a neon sweatshirt under blacklight, and you would transform, instantly, into a human lava lamp, seams and stitching lighting up along with the fabric, white socks practically incandescent, teeth glowing if you smiled wide enough. It was not an accident that neon and roller rinks became so tightly linked in the decade's memory. The two were made for each other, one supplying the colour, the other supplying the light source to make that colour do something genuinely magical. There was an undeniable optimism baked into all of it too, a kind of loud, unembarrassed cheerfulness that ran counter to the quieter, more muted palettes fashionable in decades before and after. Wearing head-to-toe neon was not really about taste, in the traditional sense. It was closer to a mood, a decision to greet the day the way a highlighter greets a page, unmissable, insistent, slightly aggressive about its own visibility. Critics at the time occasionally complained that the combinations looked less like outfits and more like the results of a colour blindness test gone rogue, and honestly, that comparison was not far off. Several of these get-ups genuinely could have doubled as diagnostic tools for an optometrist's office. By the early 90s the volume finally started to come down, palettes softened into grunge's muted flannels and earth tones, and neon retreated mostly to specific pockets, workout gear, the occasional accessory, safety equipment where it had started in the first place. But for a solid few years in the middle of the decade, walking into an American mall meant walking into a wall of colour loud enough to have its own soundtrack, and somehow everyone involved seemed entirely at peace with that. Lying here now, room dim, colours reduced to soft shapes and shadow, it is worth appreciating that nothing in your closet tonight requires sunglasses to look at directly. No blacklight is about to reveal a secret glow hiding in your blanket. Just quiet, ordinary, forgettable colour, doing exactly what colour is supposed to do at bedtime, which is nothing at all. You pull on a pair of leg warmers over your leotard, crank up the Virtus and prepare to sweat to the oldies, except the oldies are brand new and Jane Fonda is somehow both terrifying and inspiring at the same time. Aerobics exploded into a full lifestyle, complete with headbands, thong leotards, and enough spandex to reupholster a couch. Leg warmers, originally worn by actual ballet dancers to keep muscles warm, became a fashion statement for people whose closest brush with dance was the occasional aisle shuffle at the grocery store. Your living room at this point has quietly transformed into a gymnasium. The coffee table has been shoved against the wall. The shag carpet, still slightly damp from last week's session, has become a de facto exercise mat. Somewhere a VCR clunks and whirs as it swallows a tape labelled Jane Fonda's Workout, a video that would go on to sell over 17 million copies and sit as the best-selling home video release for years, outlasting several presidencies and at least one of your relationships. You press play, and a woman in a leotard the colour of a bruised plum appears on your television, smiling with the calm confidence of someone who has never once questioned whether her hamstrings could handle this. The smell of the room tells its own story. Hairspray drifting down from earlier in the day, the faint rubbery tang of a foam exercise mat, and underneath it all, the specific. unmistakable aroma of terry cloth headbands that have absorbed more sweat than any piece of fabric was ever designed to hold. The sound is just as distinctive, a rhythmic squeak of spandex against spandex, punctuated by an instructor's voice counting out on 5, 6, 7, 8, with the enthusiasm of someone who has genuinely never experienced a Monday. The leg warmers themselves deserve a moment of respect, because they didn't start out as a joke. Ballet dancers had worn them for decades, thick knitted wool tubes slipped over tights to keep calf muscles warm between rehearsals, preventing cramps in cold, drafty studios. They were practical, unglamorous, and entirely functional. Then Flashdance arrived in 1983, and suddenly a welder in Pittsburgh who moonlighted as an exotic dancer was ripping the neckline off an oversized sweatshirt, pulling on a pair of leg warmers, and becoming the most copied silhouette in America. Within months, leg warmers had nothing to do with keeping muscles supple. They were worn over jeans, over sneakers, over absolutely nothing athletic whatsoever, purely because they looked like you might, at any moment, break into a dance number involving a folding chair and a bucket of water. Meanwhile, the thong leotard was quietly staging its own uncomfortable revolution. Cut high on the hip in a way that seemed engineered specifically to test the wearer's relationship with dignity, the high-cut leotard became standard aerobics attire, the kind of garment that required constant subtle adjustment mid-workout. A move so universal among 80s exercisers, it practically became its own step in the routine. Add fishnet stockings underneath for extra flair, because apparently regular leg exposure wasn't dramatic enough, and you had an outfit that looked less like fitness wear and more like a costume for a superhero whose only power was cardiovascular endurance. Spandex itself, a fabric that had existed since the late 1950s under names like Lycra, finally found its true calling in this decade. Suddenly, it was everywhere, hugging every limb with the tight, unforgiving embrace of a fabric that had strong opinions about your body and was not shy about sharing them. Being fully dressed in spandex felt a bit like being vacuum sealed for the specific purpose of doing jumping jacks, and yet nobody complained, because complaining would have required breath that wasn't currently being spent on counting reps out loud with 40 strangers. This wasn't just Jane Fonda's show, either, although she was undeniably the Empire's reigning queen, having built a fitness studio in Beverly Hills before parlaying it into a home video business so successful it essentially invented the modern workout tape as a category. Richard Simmons brought his own frizzy head, endlessly encouraging energy to the format with Sweat into the Oldies, turning aerobics into something closer to a variety show than a workout. Jazzercise, founded back in 1969 but exploding into strip malls across the country throughout the decade, gave suburban gymnasiums their own leotarded army, all moving in unison to music that somehow made disco sound aerobic. Aerobic studios popped up in office parks and church basements alike, fluorescent lighting overhead, mirrored walls multiplying every misstep by a factor of infinity. Consider for a moment what this must have looked like to an outside observer with zero context. A woman is bouncing in place, wearing wool tubes on her calves, a leotard cut like dental floss, a headband soaking up sweat like a tiny terry cloth dam, all while a television instructs her, with relentless positivity, to feel the burn. If a fitness influencer today told you to strap knee socks over your pyjama pants before attempting a plank, you would, quite reasonably, assume you were being pranked. In 1984, you would have simply reached for a second pair of leg warmers, because clearly one wasn't making enough of a statement. The home video format itself changed everything about how people worked out. Before this, exercise generally required leaving the house, driving somewhere, and being seen sweating by strangers in real time. The VCR revolution let the gym come directly to your living room, on your schedule, in your own leotard, with your own dignity intact, or at least contained within 4 walls instead of a public facility. It was, in its own clunky tape rewinding way, the great-grandparent of every streamed workout class and fitness app that would follow decades later, minus the algorithm, plus significantly more leg warmers. Before Jane Fonda ever pressed record, Olivia Newton-John had already primed the world for this exact aesthetic with her 1981 song Physical. Its music video packed with headbands, high-cut leotards, and yes, leg warmers, all set inside a gym full of men who arrive out of shape and leave transformed. Because subtlety was never really the assignment here. The song spent 10 weeks at number 1, and the video functioned as an unofficial recruitment ad for the entire aerobics movement, teaching an entire country that the correct gym outfit involved roughly as much wool on your calves as fabric everywhere else combined. Retail responded accordingly and quickly. Danskin, previously known mostly for ballet and dancewear, pivoted hard into activewear and started selling leotards in colours that had no business existing in nature. Electric fuchsia, screaming turquoise, a yellow so aggressive it practically hummed. Norma Kamali built an entire fitness-adjacent fashion line around sweatshirt fabric, proving that grey cotton fleece, cut correctly, could somehow feel glamorous. Department stores devoted entire sections to leg warmers alone, stacked in bins by colour, ribbed wool on one side, stretchy acrylic on the other, priced cheap enough that owning 6 or 7 mismatched pairs felt less like a purchase and more like a mandatory kit. Nobody wore leg warmers that matched their leotard on purpose. Clashing was the whole point. A magenta leg warmer paired defiantly with a cobalt leotard, because coordinated outfits were for people who weren't serious about their calves. The workout itself had its own strange choreography beyond the moves. Before class, or before pressing play at home, there was the ritual of arranging the space, rolling back the rug, angling the television, checking that the tape hadn't been left rewound to the wrong spot from last time. During, there was the specific agony of holding a squat while an instructor cheerfully insisted you were almost there, a phrase that in hindsight was rarely true. And after, there was the walk to the bathroom in leg warmers, gone slightly damp at the ankle, evidence not of injury but of dedication. The 1980s equivalent of a gym selfie, except nobody could see it but you, and possibly your very unimpressed cat. And here's the quietly funny part. After all that, after the thong leotards and the sweat-soaked headbands and the 17 million VHS copies sold, leg warmers eventually wandered back to exactly where they started, slipped onto the calves of actual ballet dancers, keeping muscles warm backstage, blissfully unaware that for one strange decade they had also been required attire for accountants, doing jumping jacks in their living rooms to a woman named Jane. You zip up a members-only jacket, and for a moment feel like you've joined something important, even though membership required nothing but $40 and a trip to the mall. The brand's genius was in the name itself, a jacket that implied status while being sold to literally anyone who walked in. Snap button collars, epaulettes, and a slightly military cut gave it just enough swagger to convince a generation that a windbreaker could be a personality. Feel the fabric for a second, because that matters here. It's a lightweight, slightly stiff poly blend that makes a soft rustling sound with every arm swing, not the aggressive nylon swish of a parachute pant, more of a polite whisper, the sound of a jacket that knows it's being looked at. The lining inside is thin, barely enough to keep out an autumn breeze, which raises the obvious question of what exactly this jacket was protecting you from, since the answer was mostly just other people's judgment. The brand itself started life in the mid-1970s under a company called Europe Craft Imports, a name that sounds like it was invented specifically to make a jacket manufactured in an ordinary factory feel like it had been smuggled out of a chic Parisian atelier. By the early 1980s, the jacket had found its signature look. A boxy silhouette, a spread collar that snapped shut against the wind, epaulettes on the shoulders like a general who'd wandered away from an actual army, and slash pockets that zipped shut with a satisfying little metallic bite. It came in navy, black, burgundy, and a tan that always looked slightly more expensive than it actually was. Then came the advertising, and this is where the whole scheme reveals itself for the beautifully shameless con it was. The campaign leaned entirely on the tagline, "When you put it on, something happens," which told you absolutely nothing concrete while implying everything vague and exciting. It didn't say you'd get a promotion. It didn't say you'd get a date. It just implied that some unspecified transformation, some faint upgrade to your entire personality, was folded into the lining along with the polyester filler. And people bought it, quite literally, in massive numbers, because nobody wants to be the one person who didn't experience whatever mysterious something the commercial promised. Consider the sheer audacity of naming a product members only when the only requirement for membership was walking up to a cash register with two $20 bills. It's the retail equivalent of a nightclub bouncer who lets in absolutely everyone but still makes you feel lucky to be standing there. Imagine if a modern clothing brand tried this today, calling itself something like the Inner Circle Windbreaker Company, implying a velvet rope and a guest list, while the actual barrier to entry was a debit card and a walk past the food court pretzel stand. You'd see through it in about 4 seconds. In 1984 it worked flawlessly, possibly because everyone was too busy admiring their own epaulettes to ask questions. Part of what made it land was the timing. This was a decade already obsessed with power dressing, with shoulder pads and boxy blazers projecting authority in boardrooms that had never previously let certain people through the door. The members-only jacket borrowed that same visual language, a slightly militarized cut, structured shoulders, a collar that snapped shut like a briefing was about to happen, and shrank it down to something a teenager could wear to a school dance without anyone asking exactly what unit he'd served in. It was authority you could buy off a rack, no basic training required. And it wasn't just teenagers. Businessmen wore them over suits on their commute. Television detectives wore them while chasing suspects down alleyways, which only reinforced the sense that the jacket belonged to someone slightly dangerous, slightly official, slightly in the know. Musicians wore them in music videos, which, once MTV had fully taken hold of the culture, meant the jacket was now cross-promoting itself for free every time the channel played anything with a synthesizer in it. The jacket had somehow become shorthand for a kind of low-effort competence, the visual equivalent of someone who definitely knows a guy. The jacket also benefited enormously from being endlessly, shamelessly copied. Department stores like Sears and JCPenney rushed out their own nearly identical versions within a season or two. Same snap collar, same epaulettes, same boxy cut, just missing the actual members-only label stitched inside the collar. This created a small but very real social hierarchy among teenagers who otherwise looked identical from 10 feet away. One where the difference between the genuine article and the knockoff came down to a tag nobody but you and your closest scrutinizing rival would ever actually inspect. It's a strange kind of status symbol, one whose entire proof of authenticity lived somewhere you couldn't see it, which if you think about it too long starts to feel less like fashion and more like a very low-stakes religious relic. Layering rules developed quickly and were followed with surprising discipline. The jacket went over a plain polo or a crewneck sweater, never anything too busy underneath, since the jacket itself was doing all the visual work and didn't appreciate competition. The collar, when the weather allowed, got popped up rather than folded down, a small adjustment that somehow shifted the entire jacket from windbreaker to statement piece. Sleeves got pushed up slightly at the cuff in warmer months, a gesture that suggested you had somewhere important to be and simply hadn't decided yet whether you'd be running there. The jacket also found itself an unlikely two-generation appeal that few other trends of the decade managed. Teenagers wore it to look sharp at the mall. Their fathers wore an identical version, often the exact same size and colour, over a golf shirt on a Saturday morning, running errands with the same collar-popped confidence. For a brief window in the mid-80s, it was entirely possible for a father and son to show up to a family gathering in matching jackets purchased at completely different stores 3 years apart. Both convinced they'd made an independent-style choice. Both technically correct that something was indeed happening. Of course, exclusivity built entirely on marketing language has a shelf life. And by the tail end of the decade, the jacket's mystique had worn thinner than its lining. Everyone owned one. Your gym teacher owned one. Possibly your dentist owned one. When literally everyone is a member, the club stops feeling like a club and starts feeling like the DMV. Sales slowed. Trends moved on toward looser, boxier silhouettes, and the jacket that once promised something happens quietly slid into the back of closets across the country, joining the ranks of things that seemed important at the time. But here's the twist nobody saw coming from inside 1985. Decades later, the jacket resurfaced, first ironically among collectors hunting vintage windbreakers, then sincerely, as an entire new generation decided the boxy silhouette and snap collar actually looked kind of great. The jacket that once sold status through a clever name is now sold through actual nostalgia, which is, if you think about it for even a second, a slightly more honest kind of exclusivity. This time at least, something really did happen. It just took 40 years. You rip a hole in your t-shirt, safety pin it back together on purpose, and suddenly you're a walking rebellion. Punk fashion, born from anger and boredom in the late 70s, bled into the 80s mainstream, softened just enough to be sold at the mall alongside new wave sleeker, synthesizer-friendly cousin, all skinny ties, asymmetric haircuts, and eyeliner on everyone. What started as a middle finger to the establishment eventually got its own rack at the department store, which is either tragic or hilarious depending on how punk you actually were. Trace it back far enough, and you land in mid-1970s London and New York, two cities with very different reasons to be furious but strikingly similar wardrobes. In London, it was youth unemployment, grim economic prospects, and a general sense that the future had been quietly cancelled. In New York, it was grimy clubs like CBGB, where bands played to rooms that smelled like spilled beer and electrical tape. Out of that mess came a look engineered to be as unpleasant as possible to polite society. Ripped clothing held together with safety pins instead of thread, bondage trousers with straps connecting one leg to the other, trash bags worn as improvised couture, and hair chopped short and spiked with anything on hand, soap, sugar water, whatever would hold a shape long enough to frighten someone's grandmother. Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren get a lot of the credit here. Running a boutique on King's Road that sold deliberately shredded shirts and bondage gear to teenagers who wanted to look like the world had already ended and they simply hadn't bothered attending the funeral. Bands like the Sex Pistols wore it like a uniform, safety pins through cheeks and ears in place of jewellery, because regular earrings apparently weren't upsetting enough. The whole aesthetic ran on a very specific kind of texture, rough denim, torn fishnet, the cold metal bite of a safety pin pressed flat against skin, and a smell that was somehow always faintly of cigarette smoke, even indoors. New Wave arrived a few years later as punk's tidier, more commercially minded relative, trading raw aggression for angular haircuts and synthesizers. Where punk sounded like a car crash, New Wave sounded like a car crash remixed by someone with a drum machine and an art school degree. Bands like Devo, Blondie and the Cars leaned into a sleeker visual language. Skinny ties knotted tight against narrow lapels, asymmetric haircuts shaved on one side and swept dramatically over the other, and eyeliner applied generously regardless of gender. Because if a decade was going to insist everyone look slightly startled, it might as well look intentional. Duran Duran took the polish even further, all pastel suits and permed hair, proving that rebellion. Once it acquired a marketing budget, could be worn to a school dance without anyone's parents actually objecting. And this is where the whole thing gets quietly funny. Punk's entire founding principle was rejecting the mainstream, screaming no as loudly and messily as possible at anyone trying to sell you something. And yet within a few short years, that exact look. The ripped shirts, the safety pins, the spiked collars was hanging on a rack at the mall between the acid-wash jeans and the members-only jackets, price-tagged and folded, ready for a suburban teenager with a weekend allowance to buy an off-the-shelf version of Anarchy. Somewhere a factory in another country was mass-producing pre-ripped t-shirts with safety pins already threaded through them, which is a sentence that would have made an actual 1977 punk lie down in traffic out of sheer despair. Picture the scene at your local mall in 1984. A kid walks in wearing a leather jacket studded with metal spikes, hair gelled into a 2-inch mohawk, and buys the whole look, jacket, spikes, temporary hair dye in a single transaction using a credit card his father co-signed. He walks out looking like he just crawled out of a burning building, and technically, in a financial sense, his family's minivan is idling right outside to drive him home for dinner. It's the fashion equivalent of ordering a rebellion to go, extra safety pins, hold the actual consequences. MTV helped cement this transformation, because once the channel launched, image mattered as much as sound, and New Wave's angular haircuts and skinny ties photographed beautifully in the tight, moody lighting of a music video. Punk's raw edges got smoothed considerably in the process, trading actual anger for something closer to an aesthetic mood board, easier to replicate with a can of hairspray and a thrifted blazer than an entire worldview about the collapse of society. There was also a whole subgenre growing alongside straight new wave called New Romantic, mostly out of London club nights, where Adamant painted his face with a white stripe across the nose like a highwayman who'd wandered into a costume shop, and Boy George of Culture Club floated through videos in braided hair, dramatic hats, and makeup applied with more precision than most wedding parties manage today. Eyeliner on a man had once been a genuinely radical, faintly dangerous statement. By the mid-80s it had drifted close enough to mainstream that plenty of suburban dads simply assumed it was just how pop stars look now, the same unbothered way that accepted shoulder pads on their daughters and windbreakers on their sons. Getting the actual look together at home was its own small ordeal, and rarely as effortless as it appeared on stage. A homemade mohawk usually meant soap or gel worked into damp hair for an hour, sometimes egg whites if you were feeling ambitious and didn't mind smelling faintly of breakfast for the rest of the day, all in pursuit of spikes that would inevitably droop by third period regardless of effort. Ripped clothing had to look accidental despite being carefully deliberately shredded the night before with a pair of scissors and occasionally a cheese grater for texture nobody asked for. It was labour dressed up as carelessness, which is, in its own way, the most 80s contradiction of the entire decade. By the late 80s, the line between rebellion and retail had all but disappeared. Skinny ties showed up on sitcom characters. Asymmetric haircuts became a service you could request at any suburban salon, listed right there on the price sheet between a perm and a trim. Eyeliner crossed over onto male pop stars so thoroughly that by 1985 it barely registered as unusual anymore. What began as a genuine howl of dissatisfaction had within a single decade become something you could buy in a shopping centre food court between a cinnamon pretzel and a new pair of jelly shoes. The kids with the real safety pins from 1977 were by then somewhere in the back of that same mall, watching all of it happen and quietly wondering when exactly the revolution got a store credit card. You pop your collar, tie a sweater loosely around your shoulders, and step into a world of boat shoes and pastel polos that looks suspiciously like a country club that never lets you actually see the country club. The preppy look, driven hard by Ralph Lauren and the official preppy handbook, sold an entire fantasy of old money to people who had never sailed anything larger than a paddle boat. It was clean, it was quiet, and it was the exact opposite of everything neon happening one aisle over. Everything about this look is designed to feel effortless, while requiring an almost absurd amount of deliberate effort. The pastel polo shirt, cotton, breathable, faintly starchy against the collarbone, has to have its collar popped just so, high enough to suggest nautical confidence. Not so high that it looks like you're hiding from someone. The sweater tied around your shoulders isn't for warmth, since you will never once actually put your arms through the sleeves. It exists purely as a prop, a soft cashmere accessory whose entire job is implying you might, at some point today, be near a boat, even though the closest you've come to open water is the community pool. The official Preppy Handbook, published in 1980 by Lisa Birnbach, functioned as a satirical field guide to this entire lifestyle, complete with illustrations explaining proper monogram placement and the correct way to wear a headband while playing tennis you don't actually know how to play. The joke of the book was that it was gently mocking old money boarding school culture. The tragedy, or the triumph depending on your closet, is that thousands of readers took it as a sincere instruction manual and went shopping accordingly. Satire, it turns out, is a remarkably effective marketing strategy when nobody bothers reading past the illustrations. Ralph Lauren, meanwhile, had already spent the previous decade building an entire universe around this fantasy, launching Polo in 1967 and spending the years since selling not just clothing, but an entire imagined biography. The vision of a family estate, a stable of horses, a wood-panelled study with a fireplace crackling somewhere just off camera. His advertisements rarely showed the clothing in isolation. They showed entire scenes, a family gathered on a lawn in matching knitwear. Golden retrievers included at no extra charge, selling a complete narrative you could purchase piece by piece, starting with a $40 shirt featuring an embroidered horse and rider on the chest. The actual garments themselves told the same story in quieter detail. Lacoste's alligator polo, argyle sweater vests in soft diamond patterns, whale print belts that somehow made a literal marine mammal look aspirational, and Sperry topsider boat shoes, worn without socks, regardless of temperature, their leather soles squeaking faintly against hardwood floors that had never once been near an actual dock. The fabric felt different from everything else happening in the decade too. Soft, brushed cotton and lambswool instead of shiny nylon or stiff acid-washed denim. Everything muted into pastels, pale pink, seafoam green, buttery yellow. Colours that looked like they'd been left out in gentle sunlight for exactly the right amount of time. Ralph Lauren wasn't operating alone in this fantasy either. Brooks Brothers, already well over a century old by this point, supplied the button-down Oxford shirts that formed the quiet backbone of the whole look, while J Press handled tweed blazers and rep ties striped in colours borrowed from clubs and regiments most customers had no actual connection to. L.L. Bean, mail order catalogue and all, contributed rugged duck boots that promised authenticity through function, waterproof leather bottoms and canvas uppers meant for Maine winters, worn instead by teenagers whose most demanding outdoor activity was walking briskly between a parked car and a shopping mall entrance. Monogramming turned up everywhere. 3 embroidered initials stitched onto sweaters. Tote bags, even bathrobes. A small detail that did an enormous amount of quiet bragging without ever raising its voice. The whole aesthetic borrowed heavily from actual sports, though rarely from anyone who played them competitively. Tennis whites, all crisp cotton and pleated shorts, got worn to school despite most wearers never having picked up a racket outside of gym class. Croquet mallets appeared on sweaters as embroidered decoration far more often than they appeared on actual lawns. It's worth noting the contrast this created against the rest of the decade's television landscape, where shows like Dynasty were busy selling gowns, furs and shoulder pads dipped in gold thread. An entirely different, louder fantasy of wealth built on visible spending. Preppy fashion offered the opposite pitch. Wealth so old and so settled it never needed to shout. expressed instead through a slightly faded pink polo that looked, quite deliberately, like it had been worn on a boat every summer since 1962. There's something almost soothing in how quiet this entire aesthetic was compared to everything surrounding it. While one aisle over, neon and colour blocking were assaulting the human eye with electric greens and radioactive pinks, the preppy rack sat there in soft khaki and pale blue, whispering rather than shouting, as though it had never once needed to raise its voice to get attention, because attention, in this particular fantasy, was supposed to already belong to you by birthright, which is of course the entire joke buried inside the trend. This was a look built entirely around implying inherited wealth, family sailboats, grandparents with a summer house, none of which most of the people wearing it actually possessed. A teenager in Ohio could put on a Ralph Lauren polo, knot a sweater around his shoulders, slip into boat shoes, and for a few hours convincingly cosplay as someone whose family had been vacationing on Nantucket since the Mayflower docked. It's the sartorial equivalent of buying a name tag that says, "Hello, my name is Old Money," and simply hoping nobody asks any follow-up questions about your actual family history. And it worked remarkably well, largely because the whole look was designed to be quiet confidence rather than loud declaration. You didn't need to explain the outfit. It explained itself, or rather, it implied an explanation so smoothly that nobody thought to question it. The country club aesthetic sold itself to an entire generation of people who had never set foot inside one, proving that in the 1980s. Exclusivity wasn't really about who you were. It was about which pastel colour you were willing to commit to, and whether you could tie a sweater not convincing enough to make a stranger assume you owned a boat you had in fact never once seen. You flip on the television and suddenly clothing has a soundtrack. MTV launched in 1981, and within a few years, what a musician wore in a 3-minute video mattered as much as the song itself, turning fashion into a performance you could rewind and study frame by frame. Kids didn't just want to hear Madonna or Duran Duran, they wanted to dress like they just stepped out of the same video, lighting included if possible. Consider what actually happened the moment MTV signed on the air with a grainy clip of the Buggles singing "Video Killed the Radio Star." Before that broadcast, music was something you listened to, on a record, on the radio, maybe glimpsed briefly on a late-night variety show if a band happened to be touring nearby. After it, music became something you watched, repeatedly, at whatever hour you happened to be near a television, which for most teenagers in this decade was essentially always. And once music became visual, clothing stopped being incidental. It became the entire second half of the performance. Think about the mechanics of how this actually reached your closet. A video would air, say, 3 or 4 times over a weekend. You'd sit cross-legged on the carpet a foot from the screen. VCR paused and unpaused as you tried to catch the exact shade of a jacket or the precise angle of a popped collar before the shot cut away. There was no pausing a live stream and zooming in back then, no screenshotting a frame to text your friends. You had timing, memory, and a willingness to rewatch the same 3 minutes of tape until the details burned themselves into your brain well enough to recreate at the mall that weekend. Duran Duran turned this into an art form, filming videos in exotic locations, on yachts, in deserts, draped in pastel suits with sleeves pushed up just enough to suggest effortless wealth, and within weeks, department stores were stocking watered-down versions of exactly that look. Cyndi Lauper did the opposite, embracing a thrift store chaos of clashing patterns, layered lace and hair-dyed colours that didn't previously exist in nature. And teenagers who could never dream of affording a stylist recreated her look for the price of a fabric dye kit and a fearless attitude toward pattern mixing. The video wasn't selling a song anymore. It was selling an entire wardrobe, one carefully lit frame at a time. The visual intensity of it all changed the calculation for every artist trying to break through. A song used to be enough. Now you needed a look striking enough to survive constant repetition on a channel that played the same handful of videos in heavy rotation, sometimes a dozen times a day. Artists who understood this thrived. Bands who ignored it and simply stood in a studio playing their instruments looked instantly dated next to acts who understood that the camera needed something to actually look at. Structured shoulders, dramatic makeup, hair sculpted into shapes that had never previously occurred in human history. There's something almost theatrical about how deliberately constructed all of it was. Every outfit in every video functioned like a costume in a 3-minute play, engineered to read clearly even on a small television screen with a slightly fuzzy antenna signal. Bold colours, sharp silhouettes, exaggerated proportions, all of it existed to survive the compression of a low-resolution broadcast and still land with impact. Fashion had always been on some level about being seen. MTV simply added a rewind button and an audience numbering in the millions, all absorbing the same 4-minute fashion lesson simultaneously. And the kids watching didn't just admire it from a distance. They performed it right back, lip-syncing into hairbrushes in bedroom mirrors, wearing torn lace gloves to school the following Monday, teasing their hair into shapes borrowed directly from whatever video had aired most recently. Fashion had quietly stopped being something you simply wore and became something you rehearsed. A costume for a life you were narrating to yourself as though a camera might be rolling at any moment, because in a strange sense, thanks to a channel that never stopped playing, one always felt like it might be. There's a reason British bands dominated MTV's early years so thoroughly it briefly earned the nickname the Second British Invasion. Acts like Duran Duran, Culture Club and Eurythmics had already been thinking visually for years, shaped by a domestic music culture that took album covers and stage presentation seriously long before American radio first acts ever had to. When MTV suddenly needed hours of programming to fill a brand new 24-hour channel, these bands had polished, art-directed videos already sitting on a shelf, ready to air, while plenty of American acts were still figuring out that a music video needed to be something more than 4 guys standing in a rehearsal room. The channel rewarded whoever understood the assignment first, and for a while that mostly meant a very well-dressed contingent from London. The on-air hosts mattered here too, in a way that's easy to forget. The original MTV VJs Nina Blackwood, Mark Goodman, Martha Quinn, Alan Hunter and JJ Jackson became minor celebrities purely by standing between videos and talking, and their own wardrobes, casually stylish, always slightly aspirational, gave viewers yet another layer of fashion to absorb between songs. They weren't performing in a 3-minute video with a full art department behind them, just introducing one, and yet teenagers still studied what they wore the way they studied the artist themselves, because by this point, literally everyone appearing on the channel had been quietly enlisted into the fashion show. There was also a very practical, almost technical reason certain looks thrived on screen, while others vanished into static. Televisions in the early 80s were small, often boxy sets, with soft, slightly blurred resolution, watched from across a living room rather than up close. Fine detail simply didn't survive that journey. Bold shoulders read clearly. Strong colour blocks read clearly. A subtle pattern or a muted, tasteful outfit tended to dissolve into a grey smear by the time it travelled from a studio camera to a home antenna. Musicians and stylists learned this quickly, whether or not anyone said it out loud, and pushed toward exaggeration almost as a technical necessity. Structured shoulders, saturated primary colours, hair teased tall enough to register as a silhouette rather than a detail. The medium itself was quietly dictating the wardrobe. It's worth sitting with the fact that an entire industry of self-presentation, the influencer, the content creator, the person perfecting an outfit specifically because a camera might catch it, effectively got its dress rehearsal decades early, on a cable channel, playing 3-minute videos to bored teenagers on shag carpet. MTV didn't just play music, it taught an entire generation that getting dressed was a performance worth rewinding, and nobody in 1983, teased hair and all, seemed to mind being the opening act. You step through the sliding doors into recycled air, fountain mist, and the specific smell of Cinnabon fighting Sparrow for dominance. The 80s mall wasn't just a place to shop, it was the entire social calendar, a climate-controlled ecosystem where teenagers loitered for hours buying nothing but a slice of pizza and a soft pretzel. Arcades buzzed, food courts hummed, and somewhere a boombox was definitely playing something with a saxophone solo. The modern shopping mall, as most people picture it, 2 stories of glass and terrazzo tile wrapped around a fountain nobody ever saw anyone actually clean, had really only existed for a couple of decades by the time the 80s rolled around, but by then it had fully metastasized into something closer to a civic institution than a strip of stores. Every mid-sized American town seemed to have one, usually anchored on either end by a Sears and a JCPenney, like 2 elderly relatives holding up a very loud, very neon-lit family reunion in between. You didn't go to the mall because you needed something. You went because it was Friday, because your friends were going, because the alternative was sitting at home watching 4 channels of static-adjacent television, and because the mall had climate control in July and heat in January, which made it functionally the only livable public space in a 50-mile radius. Getting dropped off was its own ritual. Your mum's station wagon would idle at the entrance while you negotiated a pick-up time with the seriousness of a hostage exchange, 2 hours, maybe 3 if the movie ran long, and then you were free, released into a building specifically engineered to keep you inside it for as long as possible. No windows, no clocks visible anywhere near the stores, just soft rock piped through hidden speakers and enough fluorescent lighting to make everyone look faintly jaundiced, which handily hid the fact that most of you were also wearing enough blush to paint a barn. The food court was ground zero, not because the food was good, it mostly wasn't, but because it was the only place in the building where you could sit down without a store employee hovering nearby to ask if you needed help finding a size. You'd order something from Sparrow or Hot Dog on a Stick, then nurse a fountain soda for 90 minutes while 16 different social dramas played out at the surrounding tables. Who was dating whom, who got caught smoking behind the Spencers, whose older brother had access to a car. The tables themselves were bolted to the floor, presumably by someone who had underestimated exactly how many elbows could be applied to a single food court table by a critical mass of bored 15-year-olds. Then there was the arcade, usually called something like Aladdin's Castle or Tilt, a dark cave of flashing lights and joystick violence tucked near the movie theatre, where quarters disappeared faster than anyone could explain to their parents. Pac-Man, Gallagher, Centipede, all of it humming and beeping in a chorus that sounded like a robot orchestra warming up. You'd stand 2 feet from a stranger for 20 minutes, shoulder to shoulder, neither of you speaking. Both of you fully invested in whether he was going to beat his own high score. It was, in retrospect, an extremely 80s form of intimacy. But the real engine of the mall wasn't the food or the games, it was the clothes. Because the mall was where fashion actually happened. Merry-go-round, Chess King, Contempo Casuals, County Seat, each store blasting a slightly different genre of music into the corridor to lure you in, each one selling some version of the exact same acid-wash jean with a different logo stitched on the back pocket. You didn't need a fashion magazine to know what was cool. You just needed to walk the length of the mall once, slowly, and take inventory of what every other teenager was wearing. Because the mall itself functioned as a runway that updated in real time. If 3 girls in 1 week were wearing the same rubber bracelets from Claire's, that was the trend. No committee required, no vote taken, just pure teenage consensus formed one purchase at a time. Claire's deserves its own moment of respect here, honestly. A glittering cave of clip-on earrings, scrunchies, mood rings, and ear-piercing guns operated by a bored 17-year-old with a name tag and zero hesitation. You'd walk in for one thing and leave 20 minutes later having spent your entire allowance on plastic bangles that would turn your wrist green by Tuesday. Nobody cared. Green wrist was a small price for a dozen bracelets stacked halfway to your elbow, clinking every time you moved like a very cheap wind chime. And you couldn't talk about them all without talking about the payphones, 4 of them in a row near the restrooms, permanently occupied, the community bulletin board of a pre-cell phone world. You'd feed in a quarter to call home and check in, or worse, to call a boy you liked and immediately hang up the second someone picked up. A manoeuvre so common it barely qualified as embarrassing anymore. There was no group text. There was just a hallway of payphones and the very real possibility that your crush's mother would answer and you'd have to pretend you'd dialed the wrong number, badly, out loud in front of your friends. By late afternoon the whole place would be thick with the specific perfume of the era, aquanet drifting out of an open salon door, Cinnabon frosting, chlorine from the fountain, and the faint ozone smell of the arcade's ancient wiring, all of it blending into a single scent you could probably still identify blindfolded decades later. Mall walking wasn't really about destination. It was about laps, walking the same stretch of tile past the same 6 stores over and over, occasionally pretending to browse a window display while actually scoping out who else was there. Efficient it was not. But nobody was there for efficiency. There was also a specific kind of mall employee who deserves a small tribute here, the perfume counterworker at the department store entrance, armed with a spray bottle and absolutely no fear, who would spritz you with something called exclamation or electric youth as you walked past, whether you'd asked for it or not. You'd spend the rest of the afternoon smelling faintly like a candy store had merged with a chemical plant, and somehow this was considered a pleasant surprise rather than an ambush. The music store, Camelot or Musicland, ran its own gravitational pull too, a listening station where you could put on giant foam headphones and sample a cassette before committing your allowance to it, a decision-making process that could take upwards of 45 minutes for a purchase that cost less than $10. Movie theatres anchored the whole operation on weekend nights, 6 screens showing everything from teen comedies to whatever action movie had the biggest explosion on the poster, ticket lines stretching past the arcade entrance, popcorn smell folding into the general aroma of the building like one more ingredient in an already crowded recipe. You'd see the same faces from school in that line every single Friday, which meant the movie itself was almost beside the point, since half the fun was standing in the lobby deciding who was there with whom. Eventually your ride would show up, 10 minutes late, and you'd pile into the car smelling like pretzel salt and second-hand cigarette smoke from the arcade, clutching a small paper bag with something in it that felt, at the time, like the most important purchase of your entire life. Decades later, plenty of those same malls sit half empty, or gone entirely, replaced by parking lots and the internet, and there's a particular kind of nostalgia reserved for a building whose entire cultural purpose was made obsolete by a phone that fits in your pocket. Funny how the mall promised to be forever, and it turned out the food court chairs outlasted the whole institution. You layer lace fingerless gloves over rubber bracelets, add a crucifix necklace you absolutely did not earn in a religious sense, and tease your hair until it defies several laws of physics. Madonna's early 80s look, part thrift store, part streetwalker chic, part accidental fashion revolution, turned rebellion into something you could buy in a mall kiosk by Friday. Millions of girls copied it down to the smudged eyeliner, much to the horror of their mothers. Before she was selling out arenas, Madonna was scraping by in downtown New York, sleeping on friends' couches, dancing in clubs, and dressing out of thrift stores because thrift stores were what she could afford, not because a stylist had decided distressed was the new polished. That's an important detail, because most of what became the defining Madonna look of 1983 and 1984 wasn't designed in a boardroom. It was assembled out of necessity, torn t-shirt here, a men's undershirt there. layered jewellery that was really just whatever she found in a bin, and it only became a movement once millions of girls with actual disposable income decided that poverty chic was the most exciting thing they'd ever seen. The look, once it crystallised, had a specific uniform quality to it. Lace gloves with the fingers cut out, worn less for warmth and more because they looked like something a Victorian ghost might wear to a nightclub. Layers of rubber bracelets stacked up the forearm in every neon colour available, because if one bracelet said something, 20 said it louder. A big crucifix, sometimes several, dangling next to a boy toy belt buckle, an accessory combination so aggressively contradictory, Catholic guilt and open flirtation in the same outfit, that it practically guaranteed a phone call to your school principal. Underneath it all, ripped fishnet stockings, sometimes with holes deliberately widened by hand the night before, worn with ankle boots or, memorably, with lace-up combat boots that had absolutely nothing to do with combat. Then there was the hair, teased into a tangled, sun-bleached mess and topped with a black rubber headband or a lace bow, because apparently even chaos needed an accessory to announce that it was chaos on purpose. The makeup followed the same logic. Dark, smudged eyeliner applied with the general precision of someone getting ready in a moving car, a look that suggested you'd either just woken up or hadn't gone to sleep yet, and either interpretation was considered a compliment. The turning point, culturally speaking, was the 1984 MTV Video Music Awards, where Madonna performed like a virgin in a white wedding dress, rolled around on the stage floor, flashed a garter, and generally treated the sanctity of bridal wear the way a toddler treats a birthday cake. Parents were horrified, teenagers were riveted, and within about a week, department stores were fielding requests for lace gloves and rubber bracelets from girls who had never once considered wearing a crucifix as a fashion statement before that broadcast. The look spread not through runway shows but through pure imitation, girls recreating it in bedrooms with safety pins and dollar store jewellery. Proof that you didn't need a couture budget to participate, you just needed scissors and a mother who wasn't paying close attention to the bathroom mirror. Movies helped cement it further. Desperately Seeking Susan in 1985 put Madonna's aesthetic directly on screen as a character, sunglasses, layered vests, that same jumble of jewellery, and suddenly the wardrobe department had done for shopping malls what a hurricane does for plywood sales. Costume designers reported that after the film's release, second-hand and vintage stores across the country saw a genuine spike in customers hunting for exactly the kind of mismatched, thrifted pieces the character wore. Which is a strange kind of irony, an entire industry retroactively monetizing the look of not having any money. Parents, unsurprisingly, hated most of it, and not quietly. Tar meetings in some towns reportedly included actual discussion of the appropriateness of crucifix jewellery paired with midriff bearing tops, which is a sentence that could only have existed in 1985. Catholic groups in particular were uneasy about the casual mixing of overtly sexual imagery with religious iconography, missing, or perhaps not missing at all. But the tension between the two was the entire point. Madonna wasn't being careless. She understood exactly how much noise a lace glove and a crucifix could make when worn together by someone singing about being touched for the very first time. For the girls actually wearing it, though, the appeal had very little to do with theology and everything to do with permission. The look gave you a socially acceptable excuse to be a little messy, a little loud, a little too much, at an age when most fashion advice up to that point had been about looking neat, matching, presentable. Suddenly presentable was optional. You could show up with smudged eyeliner and half your bracelets mismatched and call it intentional, because technically, on some level it was, since intentional messiness was the entire aesthetic. Of course, the mall version of the look softened considerably from its downtown Manhattan origins. What started as genuine thrift store improvisation got manufactured, packaged and sold back to suburban teenagers in a slightly sanitized form, plastic crucifixes instead of real jewellery, factory-distressed lace instead of actual wear and tear. The whole rebellion available for $12 at a kiosk between the pretzel stand and the shoe store. There's something almost poetic about a look built on scarcity and thrift store necessity getting fully commercialised within about 18 months, though nobody involved seemed particularly bothered by the irony, least of all the girls buying it, who mostly just wanted to look like they'd rolled out of bed in a music video. Radio and MTV rotation only accelerated the spread, since the whole point of the format was repetition, the same 4-minute video playing dozens of times a week until the outfit felt less like a costume and more like a uniform you were somehow already familiar with. Magazines aimed at teenage girls ran features breaking down exactly how to recreate the look on a budget, step by step, as though Madonna's entire aesthetic were a recipe that just needed the right ratio of lace to rubber, which, in fairness, it more or less was. Talent shows and school dances across the country briefly turned into unofficial Madonna lookalike contests. Several girls in the same gymnasium wearing nearly identical layered necklaces and fingerless gloves, none of them having coordinated with each other, all of them having watched the same handful of music videos on repeat. By the end of the decade, the specific combination of lace, crucifixes and rubber bracelets had already started fading into just one look among many, replaced eventually by whatever came next. But for a stretch of a few years in the mid-80s, it was possible to walk into almost any mall in America and find a teenage girl dressed like a slightly confused nun who'd wandered into a nightclub, and everyone involved understood exactly what she was going for. Somewhere, a mother was quietly removing a crucifix from Claire's bag and wondering when exactly her daughter's Sunday school lessons had gotten so aesthetically confused. You slip on one sequined glove, roll up one pant leg, and immediately understand less than half of what you're doing, but all of why it looks incredible. Michael Jackson's Thriller-era style, red leather jackets, structured shoulders, loafers with no socks, became one of the most imitated looks in history practically overnight. An entire generation of kids moonwalked across linoleum floors in borrowed jackets that were several sizes too big. It's worth remembering just how enormous Thriller actually was, not as a song, though it was that too, but as a piece of visual culture. Released in December of 1983, the 14-minute short film directed by John Landis cost roughly the same as a modest feature, and aired on MTV with the frequency and reverence usually reserved for actual national events. Kids didn't just watch it once. They watched it obsessively, rewinding VH tapes to the exact frame where Michael Jackson turned toward the camera in that red and black leather jacket, structured shoulders squared off like a general reviewing troops, zippers running down the sleeves in patterns that served no functional purpose whatsoever beyond looking absolutely correct under stage lighting. The jacket alone launched 1,000 imitations. Costume shops sold out of red leather, or more often red pleather, because actual leather was a financial commitment most 12-year-olds could not make on a paper route salary. Halloween that year turned into an unofficial national Michael Jackson convention, kids showing up in whatever red jacket their parents could find, some with the zippers, most without, all of them equally confident that they had nailed the look. The jacket's whole design leaned into military and marching band influences, structured shoulders, a stiff stand-up quality, buckles and zips that gave the impression of a uniform for an army that existed purely to dance well in graveyards. Then there was the single glove, arguably the single most iconic accessory decision of the entire decade. A white glove covered in hundreds of hand-sewn rhinestones, worn on just one hand for reasons that were never fully officially explained, and therefore became one of pop culture's most enjoyable ongoing debates. Some said it was a nod to classic entertainers who wore gloves for elegance. Some speculated it drew attention to his hand movements during performances. Others believed, and there's real evidence for this one, that it may have helped mask the early effects of vitiligo, a skin condition Jackson would later speak about publicly, which was beginning to lighten patches of skin on his hands during this period. Whatever the reason, the visual effect was undeniable. A single point of dazzling light catching the stage lights every time he raised his arm, drawing the eye exactly where he wanted it. Kids couldn't get actual rhinestone gloves easily, so they improvised. One white cotton glove from a hardware store, sometimes with glitter glued on by hand, worn to school with a kind of confidence that suggested the missing several $1,000s of rhinestone work was a minor technical detail. Costume stores eventually caught up and started selling cheap sequined single gloves specifically marketed for this purpose. An entire micro-industry built around replicating one very specific fashion choice made by one very specific person. The rest of the outfit followed its own logic. Loafers worn without socks, a detail that seems minor now but at the time read as effortlessly sharp, paired with white socks that were rolled to show a flash of ankle beneath cropped pants, itself borrowed partly from the Motown showmanship tradition Jackson grew up inside. The look had a formality to it, almost old-fashioned, that stood in sharp contrast to a lot of the deliberately trashy, ripped-up aesthetics happening elsewhere in 80s fashion. Jackson's whole thing was precision. Every crease pressed, every sequin placed, every move choreographed down to the millisecond, and the clothes had to match that discipline. Structured sharp, gleaming under lights rather than looking lived in or thrifted. The moonwalk itself debuted publicly during the Motown 25 television special in 1983, when Jackson performed Billie Jean in a black sequined jacket, single glittering sock flashing under cropped black pants, turned an entire generation of school gymnasiums, driveways, and linoleum kitchen floors into impromptu dance studios. You'd see kids gliding backward across a floor in socks, arms rigid, trying to replicate a move that looked simple and was, in fact, brutally difficult, requiring a very specific shift of weight from heel to toe that most people attempted maybe 400 times before landing flat on the ground and deciding that regular walking was underrated. There was an entire secondary economy built around all of this. Sears and other department stores licensed jacket lines directly inspired by the Thriller wardrobe, complete with the zippers and shoulder detailing, marketed to parents who had absolutely no idea who Michael Jackson was, beyond the fact that their child would not stop asking for the jacket. School Picture Day that year produced an unusual number of yearbooks, featuring at least one kid in a red zip-up jacket, collar-popped, doing his best impression of a pose from a magazine cutout taped to his bedroom mirror. Armbands, another small detail borrowed from the look, showed up on sleeves at school dances, a single strip of fabric wrapped above the elbow that meant nothing functionally and everything symbolically, since wearing one signalled you'd done your homework on the wardrobe, even if your grades suggested otherwise. The military styling wasn't limited to the Thriller jacket either. Jackson's stage outfits throughout the decade kept returning to that same silhouette: epaulettes, gold braiding, high collars. A look borrowed loosely from marching band uniforms and European royal regalia, and reassembled into something that belonged to no army and every dance floor simultaneously. Fans didn't need the full uniform to get the reference. A single gold braid sewn onto a plain jacket at home, a pair of white gloves bought 2 for $1 and worn both at once, because the kid couldn't decide which hand mattered more. All of it counted, because the whole point of the trend was participation, not precision. Breakdancing crews absorbed elements of the style too. Structured jackets, single gloves, high water pants, all filtering down into street culture and back up into mainstream fashion, in a loop that happened faster than anyone could really track. Department stores stocked Michael Jackson branded jackets. Toy companies made dolls wearing the red leather outfit in miniature. Even adults who had no particular interest in pop music found themselves vaguely aware of a single sequined glove as shorthand for the entire decade, an object so specific and so strange that it somehow became universal. What's remarkable, looking back, is how much of this was built on a foundation of pure spectacle rather than practicality. None of it was comfortable. The jackets were heavy, stiff, hot under stage lights. The single glove served no function whatsoever beyond looking incredible on camera. And yet it worked so completely that decades later you can hold up a single white glove with rhinestones on it. No jacket, no music, no context. And basically everyone on the planet will know exactly who you're pretending to be. Try getting that kind of brand recognition out of an actual useful glove. You button up a boxy blazer with shoulders so structured you could balance a coffee cup on them, and step into a corporate world that is finally, grudgingly, letting women in. The power suit, immortalised by movies like Working Girl, was armour as much as fashion. A way of visually matching the size of the room full of men who didn't expect you there. It was uncomfortable. It was enormous. And it absolutely got the point across. To understand why the power suit looked the way it did, you have to understand what women were actually walking into. By the early 1980s, more women than ever were entering white-collar management positions, not because doors had been flung open, but because they'd been pried open a few inches at a time, and the workplaces on the other side had been designed, decorated, and dressed entirely around men for generations. Walking into that environment in soft, feminine clothing, the kind of thing that had dominated office fashion in previous decades, sent a certain message. And it wasn't the message most of these women were trying to send. So fashion did what fashion does. It overcorrected dramatically. And the result was a silhouette that looked less like business casual and more like a linebacker who had wandered into a shareholder meeting. Designers ran with the concept enthusiastically. Giorgio Armani built entire collections around soft yet structured tailoring unconstructed jackets that still somehow projected authority. Thierry Mugler took it further, exaggerating the shoulder to almost cartoonish proportions, structured points sharp enough that walking through a crowded hallway required the situational awareness of a school bus driver, an image that coincidentally seemed to apply to nearly everything about 80s fashion. American designers picked up the thread too, and soon shoulder pads weren't just in blazers, they were sewn into blouses, dresses, coats, even the occasional bathrobe, because if a little structure said competent, a lot of structure apparently said do not test me. Television did as much to popularise the look as any runway. Dynasty and Dallas were appointment viewing for millions of households, and the wardrobes on those shows, particularly Joan Collins as Alexis Carrington and Linda Evans as Crystal, were less about subtlety and more about weaponised glamour, structured shoulders paired with bold jewel tones, oversized jewellery, and enough shoulder architecture to double as a small awning. Nobody watching those shows was under the illusion that this was practical office wear, but the silhouette bled into real workplaces anyway, softened slightly, translated into something a person could actually wear to a budget meeting without causing a structural hazard. Underneath the theatrical influence sat a more sober set of instructions, most famously codified in John T. Molloy's book on dressing for success, which advised professional women to essentially dress like men, tailored jackets, muted colours, minimal frills, in order to be taken seriously in male-dominated offices. The advice was blunt, and depending who you ask, either pragmatic or deeply depressing. But it landed. Women's business fashion through the decade leaned hard into structured blazers, often paired with a pussy bow blouse tied at the neck. A strange little nod to femininity allowed to survive amid all that severe tailoring, as if the whole outfit were negotiating a truce between looking authoritative and not entirely erasing the fact that a woman was wearing it. The physical experience of the power suit deserves its own moment of appreciation, because it was, by most accounts, deeply impractical. Shoulder pads shifted during the day, sliding slowly toward your collarbone or drooping toward your bicep, depending on how much you'd been gesturing in meetings, requiring the occasional discreet tug, or, for the truly committed, a safety pin sewn directly into the lining to keep them anchored in place. The jackets were boxy enough to make sitting down in certain chairs a genuine spatial puzzle. Briefcases, another required prop of the look, were heavy, boxy leather things that banged against your knee on the subway and never quite closed all the way if you'd added even one extra folder. And this was all worn frequently with pantyhose that seemed engineered specifically to develop a run at the worst possible moment, usually about 4 minutes before a client meeting. Brands like Anne Klein and Liz Claiborne built entire business empires around this exact silhouette, offering slightly more affordable versions of the structured blazer and matching skirt so that women outside the executive suite could still walk into a regional sales office looking like they meant business. The colour palette stayed deliberately restrained by 80s standards: navy, charcoal, cream, maroon, a small rebellion against the neon chaos happening in every other corner of the decade's closets, because the entire point here was to be taken seriously, and taking someone seriously apparently required the absence of anything resembling a highlighter. Hair got bigger to match the shoulders, because if your silhouette was going to occupy that much vertical and horizontal space, your hairstyle needed to keep pace, resulting in a specific corporate look where a woman's head and shoulders together formed something closer to a pyramid than a human outline. Jewellery followed the same maximalist logic in miniature. Statement earrings, a chunky gold necklace, all of it meant to read as confident rather than delicate, because delicate had already been tried for several decades and had not, by most accounts, gotten women into the boardroom any faster. Commuting in the outfit presented its own daily obstacle course. Elevators became a genuine test of shoulder pad diplomacy, several structured blazers attempting to occupy the same 6 square feet of space during a Monday morning rush. Everyone angling sideways slightly to avoid a direct shoulder collision that could, in extreme cases, actually hurt. Subway turnstiles were no kinder, and sitting through an 8-hour workday in a jacket engineered more like scaffolding than clothing meant a lot of quiet shifting. A lot of jackets removed the moment the office door closed, hung carefully on the back of a chair like a suit of armour being set down after battle, because that, in a sense, was exactly what it was. Working Girl, released in 1988, crystallised the whole era on film. Melanie Griffith's character trading her big Staten Island hair and secretary wardrobe for a borrowed power suit and briefcase in order to be taken seriously in the boardrooms of Manhattan. The clothing itself functioning as a plot device, a visible marker of who got to be listened to and who didn't. The movie understood something the real fashion trend was already demonstrating, that the suit wasn't really about comfort or even personal taste. It was strategic. It was armour built specifically for rooms where you needed to visually occupy as much space as the men around you. Since apparently taking up less room had not been working out particularly well for anyone. There's a reason this particular silhouette has stuck around in the cultural imagination longer than most 80s trends, resurrected periodically whenever fashion decides oversized tailoring is back. Because underneath the exaggeration was a genuinely functional idea: clothing as leverage. It just happened to arrive wrapped in shoulder pads big enough to double as flotation devices, in colours muted enough to blend into a boardroom, worn by women who had absolutely no interest in blending in anywhere else. 4 decades later, the modern blazer has quietly shed most of that padding, gotten softer, slouchier, more relaxed, proof that eventually you can stop wearing a costume once the point has actually been made, though a few holdouts still keep a shoulder pad or 2 sewn in, presumably in case anyone forgot the message the first time. You yank your hair into a lopsided side ponytail, wrap it 3 times with a scrunchie the size of a bagel, and call it done. The scrunchie, invented in 1986, was marketed as gentle on hair, which was true, though nothing else about 80s hairstyling was gentle in the slightest. The side ponytail became a full statement, requiring its own can of hairspray and a level of commitment most people don't bring to actual relationships. The scrunchie's origin story is oddly practical for an accessory that would go on to define a decade of hair chaos. It was invented by a woman named Romy Revson, who got tired of hard plastic and metal hair elastics snagging, pulling, and generally assaulting her hair every time she took one out, and in 1986 patented a fabric covered elastic band that could hold a ponytail without leaving a dent or ripping out half your hairline in the process. It was genuinely a better mousetrap. What Revson probably didn't anticipate was that within a couple of years, the scrunchie would stop being a gentle solution to a hair problem and start being a competitive fashion event in its own right, growing larger, glitzier, and more elaborate with each passing season, made from velvet, silk, sequined fabric, occasionally something that looked suspiciously like upholstery, until the humble hair tie had ballooned into an accessory roughly the size of a dinner roll, sitting on top of your ponytail like a decorative garnish. But the scrunchie alone doesn't explain the sheer structural ambition of 80s hair, because the ponytail underneath it was rarely left to its own devices either. Achieving proper volume required teasing, a process involving a fine tooth comb dragged backward through sections of hair to create a tangled, load-bearing base underneath the smooth top layer, essentially building a hidden scaffolding of knots that no one was ever supposed to see, but that did all the actual structural work. Backcombing sessions in front of the bathroom mirror could take 20 minutes on their own, followed by a liberal, borderline reckless application of Aquanet or Rave. Aerosol hairspray so strong it could reportedly be smelled from another room, and according to several persistent urban legends of the era, was rumoured to be flammable enough to make standing near a lit birthday candle a genuinely risky decision. The side ponytail specifically carried its own social weight, positioned just above one ear. Sometimes secured with a second scrunchie a few inches down for a bubble effect, it required precision, symmetry be damned, since the entire aesthetic depended on it looking slightly off-centre and a little untamed while still holding firm through gym class, the school bus, and at least one enthusiastic dance to whatever was playing on the radio. Getting it to survive a full day required a level of hairspray commitment that left strands practically crunchy to the touch, a texture best described as somewhere between straw and a well-set meringue, and heaven help you if it rained, because a side ponytail meeting humidity was less a hairstyle and more a structural failure waiting to happen. Crimping irons added another layer entirely, a specialised tool with zigzag plates that pressed sections of hair into tight, accordion-like ridges, giving the overall effect of hair that had been recently startled. Combined with teasing and a scrunchie or two, crimped hair created volume that seemed to defy the basic physics of how much space a human head should reasonably occupy. Claw clips and banana clips joined the arsenal as well, plastic accessories designed to gather large sections of hair up and away from the face in dramatic sweeps, occasionally leaving small tender red marks on the scalp, from clips clamped just a little too enthusiastically, a minor sacrifice most people considered entirely worth it. Bangs deserve their own dedicated engineering department. The wall of bangs, teased vertically off the forehead and sprayed into a stiff, gravity-defying curtain, required a round brush, a blow dryer, and the patience of someone assembling a very fragile piece of furniture. Some styles held the bangs completely upright, a look that from certain angles resembled a small awning perched above the eyebrows, sprayed into place with such intensity that a light breeze had absolutely no effect on it whatsoever, which, depending on your perspective, was either an impressive feat of styling or a mild safety hazard in high wind conditions. Scrunchies themselves quickly became a collectible category in their own right, lined up along dresser tops in every available colour, like a small, soft trophy case. Girls kept dozens on hand specifically to coordinate with outfits, a lime green scrunchie for a lime green sweatshirt, a hot pink one for hot pink leggings, the whole system operating on a logic of matching that bordered on obsessive. Trading scrunchies at school carried its own quiet social currency, a velvet one traded for 2 cotton ones. A rare metallic version passed around a friend group like a small, fabric-wrapped heirloom. Stores leaned into the demand hard, selling multi-packs of a dozen scrunchies for a few dollars, and somehow that never felt like enough, because there was always one shade of purple you were still missing. Mornings before school added their own soundtrack to the whole ritual. the specific whir of a blow dryer running long past the point of necessity, the click and hiss of a curling iron heating up on the bathroom counter, and eventually the unmistakable psst of an aerosol can being emptied at close range. Hot rollers made their own appearance in plenty of households, pink foam cylinders heated in a plastic case and clipped into sections of hair for 15 minutes while you ate cereal, producing curls that looked salon fresh for approximately 2 hours before gravity and homeroom humidity reasserted control. And heaven help the sibling waiting for bathroom access, because an 80s hairstyle was not something you rushed, no matter how many times someone pounded on the door insisting the bus was leaving in 5 minutes. Salons of the era leaned fully into the demand, mall hair salons like Hair Cuttery and Supercuts doing brisk business in perms, the chemical kind that left the entire strip mall smelling faintly of ammonia for the better part of an afternoon. Curls tight enough that a bad perm could genuinely be mistaken for a poodle having a rough week. Teenagers saved up allowance money specifically for perms, crimping irons, and industrial-sized cans of hairspray, treating hair maintenance with a level of budgetary seriousness usually reserved for car payments. What's genuinely funny, looking back, is how much effort went into hair that was, by design meant to look almost accidental, a little wild, like you'd simply woken up that way, when in reality it represented 45 minutes of teasing, an entire can of aerosol, and at least one minor static electricity incident involving a wool sweater. And here we are decades later, watching claw clips and scrunchies quietly reappear in stores again, marketed once more as gentle and effortless, which is technically true, right up until someone tries to recreate the actual side ponytail height of 1987 and rediscovers, the hard way, that some structural engineering simply cannot be rushed. You slide your feet into a pair of jelly shoes, plastic sandals that were somehow both see-through and available in 17 colours, and immediately your feet begin to sweat in a way that feels almost celebratory. Plastic wasn't just for shoes, it took over earrings, bangles, sunglasses and belts, giving the entire decade a slightly squeaky, slightly translucent finish. It was cheap, it was colourful, and it left a waffle pattern imprinted on your foot by lunchtime. Jelly shoes weren't actually an 80s invention, not originally. They trace back to post-war France, where a shortage of leather pushed shoemakers toward a strange new material called PVC, a soft mouldable plastic that could be poured into a shoe-shaped mould and popped out looking almost respectable. For decades, jelly shoes lived a quiet life as a practical beach sandal, the kind of thing your grandmother wore to cross a scorching parking lot without her soles catching fire. Then the 1980s got a look at this humble, sensible object and did what the 1980s did to everything. It asked, sure, but what if it were hot pink and slightly sparkly? By 1985, jelly shoes had exploded out of the beach aisle entirely. Sold in bins at drugstores and department stores in colours that had no business existing, radioactive yellow, traffic cone orange, a blue so electric it seemed to buzz faintly under fluorescent lighting. The appeal was obvious and also completely irrational. Jelly shoes cost next to nothing to make, which meant you could own 5 pairs for what a single pair of leather sandals would cost your mother, and each pair felt like its own tiny commitment to a colour palette. The problem, and there was always a problem, is that PVC does not breathe. It does not wick moisture. It does not, in any meaningful sense, care about your foot's well-being. You'd slide your foot in dry in the morning, and by early afternoon you were basically wearing 2 small greenhouses, complete with condensation. The woven lattice pattern stamped into the plastic for grip left a perfect waffle iron impression across your skin, a tan line that told the whole neighbourhood exactly what shoes you owned without you having to say a word. Blisters formed in the exact spots where the plastic straps rubbed, right along the top of the foot and behind the smallest toe, and somehow this was treated as a minor tax on looking good rather than a design flaw anyone bothered to fix. And once plastic proved it could conquer footwear, it didn't stop there. It crept up the body like ivy on a fence. Earrings went plastic, giant hoops and dangling triangles moulded in the same candy-bright palette as the shoes, light enough that you could wear a pair the size of a bracelet without your earlobe filing a formal complaint. Bangles went plastic, and not just one bangle, an entire forearm's worth, stacked from wrist to elbow until your arm made a sound like a wind chime every time you reached for a locker. Sunglasses went plastic, oversized lenses in frames the colour of bubble gum, worn indoors for reasons nobody bothered to explain, because nobody needed to. Belts went plastic, cinched around the waist over an otherwise unremarkable dress, just to add one more flash of primary colour to the outfit. Barrettes went plastic, snapping shut with a small satisfying click that somehow felt more important than the actual job of holding hair in place. Even watches, which we'll get to in a moment, went plastic. If a material existed that could be poured into a mould, injected with dye, and popped out shiny by the thousands, someone in 1985 had already figured out how to wear it. Mall kiosks and drugstore spinner racks turned this into an entire microeconomy of its own, cheap enough to manufacture that a store could sell a dozen bangles for the price of one leather belt and still turn a healthy profit. Street vendors set up folding tables outside concerts and boardwalks, selling nothing but plastic charm necklaces and neon sunglasses. And teenagers bought them the way you'd buy a snack, on impulse, without a second thought. Because losing one wasn't really losing anything. This wasn't jewellery in the traditional sense of something passed down or saved for. It was fashion as a vending machine. Quick, colourful, and gone by next season. Part of what made plastic so irresistible wasn't just the colour, it was the sound and the smell. Plastic accessories had this specific chemical sweetness to them, faintly like a brand new inflatable pool toy left out in the sun. A smell that clung to store shelves and to your own wrist within about 10 minutes of putting the bangles on. And they made noise, a real audible clatter every time you moved your arm. Dozens of thin plastic rings knocking against each other like a tiny percussion section following you from class to class. You couldn't sneak anywhere wearing a full stack of bangles. Every hallway you entered, you announced yourself first with sound and only afterward with your actual face. Sit down too fast in a plastic chair and the whole stack would slide down your forearm in one long clattering avalanche, which was mildly annoying and somehow also part of the appeal. Durability, of course, was not the point. Plastic accessories were built for a kind of joyful disposability that nobody thought twice about at the time. Bangles cracked. Earrings snapped clean off a lobe mid-conversation. Jelly shoe straps split down the seam after a summer of pool visits, usually right as you were stepping onto hot asphalt, leaving you hopping toward the car on one bare foot while your friend laughed from the safety of the back seat. Nobody mourned a broken jelly shoe. You just bought another pair in a slightly different, equally aggressive colour, because they cost about as much as a movie ticket, and the mall had approximately 400 more waiting in a bin by the door. It's worth pausing on how strange this all sounds from a modern angle, and then remembering that essentially nothing has changed except the branding. Somewhere out there right now, a grown adult is paying $60 for a pair of rubber garden clogs covered in decorative pins, cheerfully sacrificing all foot ventilation for the sake of a look, and calling it self-expression. Somewhere else, a 14-year-old is stacking a dozen pastel claw clips up one forearm for a video that will disappear in 24 hours, which is, structurally, just a bangle stack with better lighting. The plastic accessory boom of the 1980s wasn't really about jelly shoes or bangles specifically. It was about a decade that had decided comfort was negotiable and visibility was not, that a little sweat and a waffle-patterned tan line were a perfectly reasonable price to pay for feeling like a walking rainbow. Somewhere in a landfill right now, a jelly shoe from 1986 is still holding its shape perfectly. Because if there's one thing PVC is exceptionally good at, it's outliving every single trend it was ever a part of. You strap on a Swatch watch with a face the colour of a highlighter and clip a fanny pack around your waist, and suddenly your wrist and your hips are both making a personal statement. Swatch turned the wristwatch into a disposable fashion accessory you could collect by the dozen, while the fanny pack solved the very real problem of where to put your Walkman batteries without a purse. Neither of these things needed to be cool. Somehow, briefly, they both were. Swatch itself was born out of a genuine crisis, not a marketing brainstorm. In the early 1980s, the Swiss watch industry was getting quietly demolished by cheap, accurate quartz movements coming out of Japan, and a handful of Swiss executives, most notably Nicholas Hayek, decided the only way to survive was to stop treating a watch like a precious heirloom and start treating it like a t-shirt. So Swatch built watches almost entirely out of plastic. Just 51 components instead of the usual 100 plus, snapped together on an assembly line instead of painstakingly hand-fitted by a craftsman who trained for a decade. The result was a watch that cost about as much as a nice lunch and told time exactly as well as one that cost $2,000, which, if you think about it, for more than a few seconds, is either deeply reassuring or deeply insulting to the entire watchmaking profession. What made Swatch a phenomenon rather than just a cheap gadget was the sheer gleeful variety. New designs dropped constantly, in colours and patterns that had nothing to do with telling time, and everything to do with looking exactly like the decade around them, geometric splashes, primary colour blocks, the occasional Keith Haring collaboration turning your wrist into a tiny moving art gallery. People didn't own one Swatch. People owned a collection, lined up in a drawer or worn several at once stacked up the forearm like a strange ticking bangle set. Because if bangles could pile up, why not watches too? There was a soft plastic smell to a brand new Swatch straight out of the box, and a distinctive light click when you snapped the band closed. A small satisfying sound that made the whole purchase feel like it mattered slightly more than it should have. Some models even had transparent cases, so you could watch the tiny gears do absolutely nothing of visual interest, which somehow still felt futuristic at the time. Collecting Swatches became its own competitive sport almost immediately, with certain limited runs turning into genuine investment pieces long before anyone used the word investment to describe a plastic watch out loud. Kids traded them at school the way earlier generations traded baseball cards, comparing who had the rarer face, who had the one with the swirl pattern nobody else's cousin could find, and whether a particular design was about to be discontinued and therefore worth holding on to. None of this logic would have applied to a normal watch. A normal watch you wore until it broke. A Swatch you wore until a better one came out, and then you kept the old one anyway, in a drawer, for reasons that had stopped being practical the moment you bought a second one. The fanny pack, meanwhile, came from a completely different world, and somehow ended up standing right next to the Swatch at the same school dance. Waist bags had existed for years as pure hiking and skiing gear, something you strapped on to keep your hands free on a trail, not something you wore to the mall. But by the mid-80s, fashion had quietly absorbed it the same way it absorbed the tracksuit, taking a piece of outdoor utility gear and putting it on kids who had never hiked anything steeper than a parking garage ramp. And it made a strange kind of sense, because the 80s had created an entire new category of things a teenager needed to carry. Cassette tapes, spare Walkman batteries, a hairbrush for emergency scrunchy repairs, lip gloss, maybe a folded note passed 3 periods ago that absolutely could not be lost. A purse felt too formal. Pockets weren't nearly big enough, especially once designer jeans got involved and pockets became more decorative than functional. The fanny pack solved it instantly, clipped snug around the waist with a satisfying snap of the buckle, riding low and a little stiff against your hip bone until the nylon softened up after a few weeks of wear. There was, undeniably, a slight indignity to the whole look. Nobody in 1987 thought a fanny pack was elegant. It sat there, boxy and practical, sometimes worn dead centre like a tool belt, sometimes shifted around to the back in a move nobody has ever successfully explained the logic of, and sometimes worn slung diagonally across the chest like a tiny off-brand ammunition belt for someone whose most dangerous mission that day was buying a soft pretzel. And yet it worked precisely because it didn't try to be anything other than what it was, a small stubborn pouch of pure function clipped to the one part of your body a purse could never quite reach. Combine it with a swatch clacking against your wrist, and you had a walking summary of the decade's whole philosophy: wear the practical thing loudly, wear the disposable thing proudly, and never ever worry about whether it matched. There was also a strange social choreography to wearing both items at once. A fanny pack meant your hands stayed free, which mattered enormously at a roller rink or an arcade, where you needed both palms available for skating, joystick duty, or holding a slice of pizza without setting anything down on a sticky surface. A swatch meant you could check the time without digging through a bag, glancing down at your own wrist mid-conversation, the way people now glance at a phone, except with considerably less anxiety attached and considerably more colour. Between the two, an entire generation had quietly solved the problem of carrying things and knowing things without needing a single free hand. Decades before anyone thought to put both functions into a single glowing rectangle. Both objects eventually faded, the swatch collection shoved into a drawer, the fanny pack demoted to something only worn ironically at theme parks or by tourists who genuinely didn't care what anyone thought, which in hindsight was probably the correct attitude all along. And both objects, with the kind of patience only fashion seems capable of, came back around exactly on schedule. Designers now sell the same waist bag, slightly restyled, slightly more expensive under the softer name belt bag, and runway shows in Paris and Milan have quietly reintroduced the plastic statement watch as retro chic collectible. Somewhere, a person who once got mildly mocked for wearing a fanny pack to the mall in 1988 is watching a supermodel wear the exact same bag down a runway 40 years later, price tag now comfortably in the hundreds of dollars, and the only appropriate response is a long, slow, deeply satisfied sigh. You zip up a shiny nylon tracksuit and immediately announce your presence in any room through pure sound alone. A rhythmic swish-swish that could be heard 2 hallways away. Tracksuits and windbreakers crossed over from athletes to everyday wear, breakdancers and joggers and kids waiting for the school bus, all dressed like they might, at any moment, be called into an Olympic event. Comfort had finally entered the fashion conversation. Loudly, the migration from locker room to living room didn't happen by accident. Brands like Adidas, with its 3 stripes running down every sleeve and pant leg, Fila, Puma, and the sleek Italian names like Sergio Tacchini and LS, had spent years building tracksuits purely for athletes, engineered to be light, breathable, and cheap to produce in bulk. Then hip-hop culture got hold of them, and everything changed. Run DMC famously strutted on stage in Adidas tracksuits, with the laces pulled out of their sneakers entirely, turning gym clothes into a full uniform of confidence, and within a couple of years, kids who had never jogged a mile in their lives were wearing the exact same setup to the mall, to school, to birthday parties, anywhere at all. Athletic wear had officially stopped being about athletics, and nobody seemed the least bit bothered by that. Breakdancing gave the tracksuit its second, equally important reason for existing. Spinning on cardboard laid over a sidewalk or a linoleum gym floor required fabric that could slide, and cotton simply couldn't do it. It would grab, bunch, and burn against your skin on the first headspin attempt. Nylon, slick and synthetic, glided beautifully, which meant the same shiny material that made a windbreaker rustle also happened to be the exact material a breakdancer needed to spin without shredding an elbow. Fashion and function had accidentally lined up perfectly, and the whole culture around it, boomboxes, linoleum mats, cardboard flattened out on a subway platform, adopted the tracksuit as its unofficial costume. Crews coordinated matching colours the way sports teams wore jerseys, partly for style, and partly so a judge at a dance battle could actually tell who belonged to which group once the spinning started. Then there was the sound, which really cannot be overstated. Nylon against nylon produces a very specific rustle, somewhere between a tent being pitched and a bag of chips being opened in a quiet movie theatre, and an 80s tracksuit produced that sound with every single step. You could hear someone coming from an entire hallway away. A rhythmic swish 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 that beat any doorbell for advance warning. Gym teachers could track a kid's location purely by ear, and sneaking into class 4 minutes late was functionally impossible in full tracksuit uniform, since the outfit itself acted as a built-in alarm system. And in the dry winter air, that same slick nylon loved to build up static electricity. So pulling a jacket off after a long day sometimes came with a visible blue spark and a small yelp. A tiny lightning show, tucked into an otherwise ordinary bedtime routine, followed immediately by a full 10 seconds of your hair standing straight up if you tried to pull the top off over your head. The smell mattered too. That warm, faintly plasticky scent nylon gets after sitting in direct sun or being tumbled in a dryer a few too many times. Not unpleasant exactly, just unmistakably synthetic. The specific aroma of a decade that had fallen hard for materials science. And the fit, oversized, roomy through the shoulders and baggy at the ankle, meant a tracksuit felt genuinely different to wear than the stiff. Structured clothing everywhere else in the 80s closet. After a day spent wrestling with shoulder pads and jeans stiff enough to stand up on their own, sliding into a tracksuit must have felt like slipping into a warm bath, one that happened to crinkle every time you rolled over. The colour choices deserve their own moment of appreciation, because tracksuits didn't stop at a single tone the way a school uniform might. Manufacturers leaned hard into colour-blocked panels, a body in one shade, sleeves in a second, a stripe down the leg in a third, sometimes 4 colours fighting for attention on a single jacket with absolutely no attempt at harmony. Purple and teal. Orange and black. A yellow so bright it looked borrowed from a road crew's safety vest, paired with hot pink for reasons no focus group ever explained. Standing next to someone in full tracksuit regalia felt a little like standing next to a walking traffic signal that had given up trying to direct anyone anywhere and had instead decided to just look spectacular while doing it. Windbreakers rode the same wave, thin, crinkly jackets in aggressive colour-blocked panels, worn zipped all the way up regardless of actual weather conditions. Because the windbreaker wasn't really about wind. It was about presence. Couples coordinated matching tracksuits for casual outings, the way other couples might coordinate outfits for a wedding. Families wore matching windbreakers on road trips so nobody got lost at a rest stop. And entire dance crews moved as a single rustling, colour-blocked unit, visible from across a parking lot before a single move had even started. Comfort had entered the fashion conversation, as promised. But it entered loudly, aggressively, impossible to ignore, in exactly the way the 80s did everything else, whether anyone asked for the noise or not. The tracksuit also quietly rewrote what counted as acceptable outside the house. Before this decade, sweatpants and jackets meant for exercise stayed in the gym bag, worn only during or immediately after actual physical activity, and showing up anywhere else in athletic gear signalled you'd either just finished a workout or forgotten to change. The 1980s dissolved that boundary completely. You could wear a tracksuit to the grocery store, to a friend's house, to a formal adjacent family gathering if you picked a nice enough colour combination, and nobody blinked, because comfort had been granted a permanent seat at the table instead of a temporary hall pass. It's a shift so complete that most people under a certain age have never known a world where wearing gym clothes to run an errand required any justification at all. It's tempting to look at today's quiet, expensive athleisure, joggers, matching sets, Everything cut from soft-brushed cotton or that whisper-quiet technical fleece. And think fashion has simply moved on from noisy synthetic tracksuits. That we've collectively agreed comfort no longer needs a soundtrack. But walk past enough people at the airport and you'll still catch that same swish-swish drifting out from underneath a much more expensive logo on a jacket that costs 4 times what an 80s original did and somehow still can't resist the same rustle. The material got quieter, marginally, the price went up considerably. The instinct never did. You pull on a pair of jeans with someone else's name stitched across your backside, and for the first time that felt like a compliment instead of a design flaw. Jordac, Guess and Sergio Valente fought a very public war for denim supremacy, backed by suggestive commercials and price tags that made a simple pair of pants feel like a personality upgrade. Whoever's horse logo or triangle patch you wore said something about who you wanted to be, even if all it really said was that you paid triple for stitching. The whole idea of a designer jean had only just been invented, and it hadn't been around long enough for anyone to question it. Calvin Klein and Gloria Vanderbilt got there first at the tail end of the 70s, slapping recognisable names onto the back pocket of an otherwise ordinary pair of jeans, and discovering almost by accident that teenagers would pay double simply for the privilege of advertising someone else's brand on their own backside. By the early 80s, this had metastasized into a full arms race. Jordac, founded by 3 immigrant brothers named Nakash, who built their empire around a leaping horse logo, positioned itself as glamorous and a little rebellious, with television commercials featuring a jingle so catchy it lodged itself permanently in the brain of anyone who owned a television between 1979 and about 1986. Sergio Valente leaned into pure European mystique, despite being about as Italian as a strip mall food court, dreamed up entirely by an American company that understood a fake accent sold more denim than an honest label ever could. And then Guess arrived and changed the entire game by treating denim advertising like a Hollywood production, black and white photography, smoky lighting, models draped over vintage cars in poses that had very little to do with pants, and everything to do with a feeling the Marciano brothers wanted you to associate with their triangle logo forever. None of this would have worked without the fit, which was the actual battlefield beneath all the marketing. Designer jeans in the 80s were not roomy, they were not forgiving. They were cut close through the hip and thigh with a rise that sat high on the waist, and getting into a pair fresh out of the dryer was less a matter of dressing and more a matter of engineering. You'd lie flat on your bed, suck in every inch of air your lungs could spare, and drag the zipper up in stages, the way you might close an overstuffed suitcase. Sometimes enlisting a sibling to lie on top of the denim while you worked the zipper the last inch. Sitting down afterward required careful negotiation, a slow controlled bend rather than a normal drop into a chair. Bending at all required careful negotiation, and yet nobody complained, because the tightness itself was the point, a visible sign that you'd committed fully to the silhouette rather than settling for something merely comfortable. The stiff dark denim had its own particular feel and smell straight off the shelf, that sharp chemical and cotton scent of fresh indigo dye, fabric so rigid it could nearly stand at attention on its own before a single wash had softened it. And the sound of walking in a brand new pair was its own small event, a stiff denim whisper with every step. Thighs rubbing together in a fabric that hadn't yet learned to bend the way your body did, producing a faint corduroy-like friction that eased up only after enough washes had beaten the stiffness out of it. It took weeks of actual wear to break a pair in properly, and once it happened, you guarded that broken-in pair like a small treasure, because a worn, familiar pair of Jordacs fit nothing like a fresh one, and losing your favourite pair to a growth spurt felt like a genuine small tragedy. The prices were the real shock, at least to anyone paying the bill. A pair of designer jeans could run $40 or $50 in early 80s money, several times what a plain department store pair cost, for what was still, structurally, a pair of pants with pockets and a zipper. Parents grumbled, pointed at the identical-looking generic jeans one aisle over, and asked the question every generation asks about every status object. What exactly are you paying for here? Kids didn't care in the slightest, because the logo wasn't decoration, it was currency. A small visible signal in the school hallway that said something about which side of the denim war you'd picked, and by extension, who you were trying to be that particular semester. Showing up in the wrong brand, or worse, an unbranded pair from a discount store, could tank a reputation faster than any fashion crime committed above the waist. It's not so different from a modern kid saving up 3 months of allowance for a specific sneaker release, except at least sneakers, in fairness, don't require you to lie down on your bed just to put them on. The rivalry even spilled into the school parking lot in ways that had nothing to do with actual denim quality. Kids could identify a brand from across a classroom purely by the stitching pattern on the back pocket, the same way you might recognise a friend by their silhouette in the dark, and arguments broke out over which label was genuinely superior. Arguments that were, structurally, indistinguishable from choosing a favourite sports team you had no real stake in beyond loyalty. Some families couldn't justify the expense at all, which meant a thriving secondary market of hand-me-downs, birthday requests, and the occasional store-brand knockoff jean stitched with a logo just close enough to the real thing to survive a hallway glance from a distance, though never close enough to survive an actual inspection. What's genuinely funny about the whole designer jeans war looking back is how little any of the brands were actually selling. Jordake, Guess and Sergio Valente were not innovating denim. They were selling the exact same basic 5-pocket jean everyone else sold, just with a different name stitched onto the pocket and a much larger advertising budget behind it. The fabric came from the same mills, the stitching pattern barely differed, and yet 3 separate companies convinced an entire generation that their specific triangle or horse or signature meant something the others didn't. It was one of the purest demonstrations in fashion history that people won't just pay for a product, they'll pay a premium for the story stitched onto it, and the story doesn't have to be true. It just has to fit. Ideally after several minutes of determined effort while lying flat on your back. You watch a teenager thrift a pair of high-waisted acid-wash jeans and wonder if the universe is simply looping. Fashion historians have long pointed to a rough 20-year cycle, where each generation reaches back, not to the decade their parents loved, but to the one their parents were embarrassed by, filtered through enough distance to feel fresh instead of dated. By that math, the 2020s were always going to fall for the 1980s, right on schedule, whether anyone planned it or not. The pattern isn't a new theory dreamed up to explain your niece's windbreaker. It's been quietly repeating itself for the better part of a century, and once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. The 1960s, in the middle of all its mod dresses and psychedelic prints, had a genuine flapper revival. Designers and young women alike suddenly enamoured with the loose silhouettes and beaded fringe of the 1920s, a full 40 years earlier by then, but resurfacing in smaller pulses along the way roughly on that same 20-year clock. The 1970s pulled hard from 1930s and 40s glamour, bias cut gowns and old Hollywood shoulders sliding back into department stores just as disco was inventing its own excess. The 1990s, right on cue, fell completely for the 1970s. Bell-bottoms, platform shoes and disco-adjacent prints reappearing on teenagers who'd been in diapers when Saturday Night Fever came out the first time around. Even the 2000s got a small early preview of the 80s, denim on denim, chunky belts, and a brief alarming return of leg warmers on people who should have known better from watching their own family photo albums. Each time, the resurrected decade wasn't the one right before it. It was the one just far enough back to have lost its embarrassment and gained its charm. The mechanism behind this is less mystical than it sounds, and it comes down mostly to timing and memory. A 20-year gap tends to land almost exactly one generation apart, long enough that the people who lived through the original trend the first time are now the parents, the ones who spent their own teenage years insisting they would never, under any circumstances, dress like that again, and who now cringe visibly every time an old yearbook photo resurfaces at a family gathering. Their kids, meanwhile, grow up surrounded by old photographs, home videos, and increasingly entire archives of footage sitting online, encountering the decade with zero embarrassment attached, because they weren't there to feel the sting of it the first time. What looked dated and cringeworthy to the generation that lived it looks bold and unfamiliar to the generation that didn't. And unfamiliar, it turns out, is most of what fashion is actually chasing. Newness doesn't have to mean never before seen. It just has to mean never seen by you, which is a considerably lower bar for an entire industry to clear season after season. There's a practical business side reason the cycle holds up too. Designers, magazine editors and costume departments are not inventing something entirely original every single season. That's an exhausting and frankly impossible standard, so they raid the archives instead. And an archive needs roughly 2 decades of distance before it stops looking like your mother's closet and starts looking like a mood board. Retailers know this, which is why vintage-inspired capsule collections seem to arrive with suspicious regularity right as a new crop of shoppers turn 16 with their first credit card. Costume designers on film sets know this too, timing a period piece to land right when the depicted decade has crossed from embarrassing into nostalgic. And the people who greenlit a certain nostalgic Netflix show set in a fictional 1980s town absolutely knew this, banking on the fact that a specific decade of denim, hairstyles and synthesizer music was due for rediscovery right as a new audience came of age with disposable income and an appetite for something that felt both old and brand new at once. There's also a quieter psychological piece to it, one that has less to do with marketing calendars and more to do with what nostalgia actually requires. Genuine nostalgia belongs to the people who lived through something the first time, the parents wincing at their own yearbook photos, not the teenagers encountering the look fresh. What the next generation experiences instead is closer to rediscovery than remembering. A fresh set of eyes stumbling onto shoulder pads, neon and stiff denim with none of the baggage that made their parents cringe every time an old photo resurfaced. It looks like nostalgia from the outside because the clothes are the same, but the emotional wiring underneath is completely different, curiosity standing in for memory. There's a reason this particular revival cycle tends to catch each new generation off guard too, even though the pattern has repeated itself so many times you'd think someone would eventually see it coming. Every decade, while it's actually happening, believes itself to be doing something unprecedented, inventing a look from scratch rather than quietly reheating something that already had its moment 40 years earlier. Nobody thrifting an oversized windbreaker in 2024 thinks of themselves as a data point confirming a sociological pattern. They just think the jacket looks good, which, in its own way, is exactly how the cycle keeps working. It doesn't need anyone to notice it in order to keep turning. It's also worth noting that the cycle rarely brings a decade back in a perfect, faithful copy, which is part of why calling it pure nostalgia misses the point entirely. Nobody today is reviving shoulder pads at their original width, or bringing back the specific eye-watering neon-on-neon combinations that defined a mall food court in 1987. What comes back is closer to a greatest hits selection, the silhouette without the discomfort, the colour palette without quite so much of the aerosol, filtered and softened through a modern lens before it's allowed back onto store shelves. The cycle borrows shapes and moods far more often than it borrows literal outfits, which is exactly why a revived decade feels familiar and strange at the same time, recognisable enough to spark that flicker of recognition in anyone who lived through it the first time, different enough that nobody watching would mistake it for an actual rerun. So when a teenager today digs a stiff faded pair of acid-wash jeans out of a thrift bin and treats it like buried treasure, They're not really reaching backward out of longing, they're reaching sideways into something that simply happens to look new to them. The 1980s didn't get chosen out of some collective sentimental impulse. They got scheduled, quietly, by a cycle that has been running on the same 20-year timer since long before anyone owned a Swatch or a fanny pack. And now that the clock has ticked back around to them, the only real question left is what the fashion archives are going to look like when Gen Z's own kids come of age and start snickering, with real affection, at their parents' skinny jeans and oversized headphones, right on schedule, exactly as planned by no one in particular. You scroll past a video of someone pulling a genuine 1985 windbreaker out of a thrift bin, like they've unearthed a pharaoh's tomb. TikTok turned thrifting from a budget necessity into a full content genre, with millions watching creators dig through second-hand racks, specifically hunting for shoulder pads, neon, and anything with a brand name stitched a little too proudly. The algorithm didn't just revive 80s fashion, it turned finding it into a competitive sport with its own trophy case. You keep scrolling, and the format never really changes, only the find does. A gloved hand flips past 40 identical black t-shirts, pauses, and yanks out something electric. And the camera does that little zoom, that tiny gasp of a jump cut, as if the fabric itself had been holding its breath waiting to be discovered. The sound design helps. Crinkling plastic hangers, the low mechanical hum of a store fan, a snippet of a synth pop song laid on top, so the whole thing feels like a movie trailer for a jacket. You would think, watching enough of these, that the entire back half of America's thrift stores had been secretly curated by a museum, when really it's just a lot of very patient people willing to touch every single thing on the rack, including the things that smell faintly of somebody's basement. And they do smell. That's the detail nobody puts in the caption. Old polyester holds on to decades the way certain rooms hold on to cigarette smoke. A little musty, a little sweet, with an undertone of fabric softener from 3 owners ago. Creators call it patina. Everyone else just calls it a smell you have to wash out twice. But that smell has somehow become part of the appeal. Proof of authenticity. The difference between a real 1987 tracksuit and a fast fashion knockoff trying to fake the wrinkles. You cannot manufacture 40 years of sitting in someone's closet. You can only wait for it, or buy it second hand for $12 from a bin that used to sell it for $0.25. That price jump is the part that would genuinely stun anyone who lived through the original decade. A shoulder-padded blazer that once got quietly donated because nobody wanted it anymore, now gets photographed under good lighting, tagged with a dozen hashtags, and listed on a resale app for the price of a nice dinner. Depop sellers built entire storefronts around exactly this pivot, learning which decades sell, which colours trend, which logos make a stranger stop scrolling. A Jordache label, once a punchline about status anxiety, is now a search term typed into a resale app with the same urgency people once reserved for concert tickets. The jeans didn't change. The audience did. What's strange, if you sit with it, is how much this resembles the original mall culture it's replacing. Teenagers in 1985 spent hours wandering a climate-controlled building for the simple thrill of finding something. A record, a jacket, a reason to be somewhere with other people their age. Teenagers now do something eerily similar, except the building is a thrift store instead of a mall, and the audience watching them dig is not the kids standing next to the rack, but several 100,000 strangers on a screen. The ritual survived. It just found a new home and brought a camera crew. There is also, underneath the humour of it, something almost archival happening. Thrifters have become accidental historians, sorting fabric by decade the way a geologist reads rock layers, learning to spot a real acid wash from a manufactured one by the pattern of the fading, learning which zipper pulls date a jacket, which stitching gives away a reproduction. Nobody set out to build expertise in late Cold War outerwear. It just happened, one bin at a time, one video at a time, until an 18-year-old with a ring light could tell you more about the construction of a 1986 members-only jacket than most fashion history professors. Of course, not every find is a victory. For every windbreaker unearthed like treasure, there are 100 quiet failures, stained collars, snapped elastic. A truly unfortunate number of shoulder pads that have somehow migrated 3 inches to the left after decades of gravity. Those don't make the final cut of the video. The algorithm rewards the win, not the 40 minutes of sorting through sweatshirts that smell like someone's uncle. So what you see online is a highlight reel of a much slower, much sweatier, much less glamorous process, one bin. One rack, one grimace at a time, edited down into 15 seconds of triumphant orchestral swell. There is a term for the best possible outcome of all this searching. A grail, borrowed from nights and quests and centuries of people looking for something meaningful in a dusty pile. In this case, the grail is usually a specific jacket from a specific decade in a specific condition. And finding one turns an ordinary Tuesday into a small personal legend you will mention at parties for years. Entire online communities exist purely to help each other identify grails. Posting blurry photos of tags and zipper pulls the way conspiracy forums post grainy photographs of something in the sky. Asking, is this real? Is this rare? Is this worth the drive across town? It is somehow a deeply earnest hobby dressed up as irony. Not everyone finds the trend charming, and it's worth sitting with why. As thrifting went from quiet necessity to online spectacle, prices at donation stores crept upward across entire categories. Not just the flashy neon pieces, but plain, practical clothing too. The kind people actually need for a job interview or a cold winter rather than a video. Employees at some chains now sort out anything that looks remotely vintage before it even reaches the floor, pricing it separately, sometimes online, sometimes to the highest bidder. The bins didn't get smaller. The audience did get bigger, and demand, as it turns out, works exactly the same way in a thrift store as it does anywhere else, driving the cost of a used windbreaker somewhere it never should have needed to go. A hobby built on frugality accidentally made frugality a little harder for everyone else, which is either deeply ironic or exactly the kind of plot twist the 80s would have appreciated. And somewhere in a distribution warehouse, a truck is unloading yet another shipment of donated clothing that nobody has sorted yet, unaware that somewhere in that pile sits a future viral moment, patiently waiting between a stained tablecloth and a single left-handed oven mitt. It always is. That's the quiet secret of thrift store content. The drama is manufactured, but the merchandise is real, 40 years old, and utterly indifferent to its own fame. So the next time you see someone gasp on camera over a neon windbreaker, know that somewhere in 1985, a person folded that same jacket into a donation bag without a second thought, genuinely relieved to be rid of it. They had no idea they were retiring a future headline. They just wanted the closet space back. You notice a kid in a members-only style jacket and high-top sneakers, and realise they've never lived a single day without a smartphone. Stranger Things, set in a fictional 1980s Indiana, single-handedly reintroduced an entire generation to scrunchies, bantees and windbreakers, turning nostalgia into aesthetic homework for viewers who weren't alive to be nostalgic in the first place. A hit show did in 4 seasons what decades of vintage stores could not. Made the 80s look genuinely desirable to people born in the 2000s. Think about what that actually required. A costume department had to convince millions of people, most of whom had zero personal memory of Reagan-era anything, that a kid biking through a fictional Indiana town in a striped shirt and denim jacket looked cooler than whatever was currently hanging in their own closet. That's not a small trick. That's closer to time travel through wardrobe alone, using nothing but careful colour grading, a synth-heavy score, and enough practical denim to reupholster a small stadium. The show's costume designers reportedly built entire archives of period-accurate clothing, sourcing real vintage pieces and studying old Sears catalogues the way historians study ancient scrolls, all so a kid on a bicycle would look like he actually belonged in 1985, instead of like an actor cosplaying his grandfather. And it worked with an efficiency that should probably concern retail analysts more than it does. Every time a new season dropped, search interest for specific pieces of the wardrobe spiked within days, sometimes hours, high-top sneakers, corduroy jackets, off-brand tracksuits, the exact striped collar polo a character wore in one scene for maybe 90 seconds of screen time. Brands noticed immediately. Sneaker companies re-released models that had been sitting quietly in warehouses for decades, sometimes literally reprinting old 1980s catalogue styles because a fictional teenager in a fictional town had worn something close enough. It is a strange kind of economy, one where a costume choice made for narrative continuity becomes 18 months later, a genuine line item in someone's quarterly earnings report. Part of what makes it work is that the show never asks you to find the 80s cool in the abstract. It asks you to find these specific kids cool, and the clothes just happen to be attached to them. You don't fall in love with acid wash denim as a concept. You fall in love with a character who happens to be wearing it while riding a bike away from something supernatural, and the emotional shortcut does the rest. Nostalgia, it turns out, doesn't actually require having lived through the thing you're nostalgic for. It just requires liking someone enough to want to dress like they did, which is essentially how fashion has always worked. Just usually with a slightly smaller time gap and considerably fewer monsters. There's also something quietly funny about the fact that an entire generation is now accurate about a decade, purely through fiction, the way someone might learn geography exclusively from board games. Ask a 14-year-old about Cold War tensions or Reagan's economic policy, and you might get a shrug. Ask that same 14-year-old what a Camaro from the show looked like, or which character wore which specific sweatshirt in Season 2, and you'll get an answer delivered with the confidence of a graduate thesis. History apparently sticks best when it comes with a soundtrack and a monster hiding in the walls. The effect didn't stop at costume pieces either. Interior design accounts started recreating character bedrooms down to the exact poster placement. Makeup tutorials walked viewers through a very specific blue eyeshadow a character wore in exactly one scene. Fan conventions built entire sections around cosplay, so period accurate it could pass a genuine 1985 inspection, if such a thing existed, which it very much did not, but you get the idea. A show about a town fighting off an alternate dimension somehow became the single most effective 80s marketing campaign the actual 1980s never had the budget or the algorithm to run. It also helped that the show arrived at exactly the right moment, a streaming era where an entire season could be devoured in a single weekend and its aesthetic absorbed all at once, rather than trickling out week by week the way shows once did. There was no slow burn to the fashion adoption. One Friday the show didn't exist in a viewer's life, and by Sunday night that same viewer had opinions about scrunchy placement and exactly which brand of high top read as authentic versus costume department fake. Binge culture didn't just change how people watched television, it changed how fast an aesthetic could colonize a closet, compressing what once took years of slow cultural diffusion into a single lost weekend and a great deal of missed sleep. Retailers, naturally, move just as fast. Fast fashion chains, the same ones that can turn a runway silhouette into a rack of cheap copies within weeks, treated each new season's premiere like a starting gun. Within days of a big cultural moment on screen, similar jackets and sneakers appeared in store windows an ocean away from where the show was even filmed, priced for a teenager's allowance rather than a costume department's budget. The 1980s, an era famous for genuinely excessive spending on personality, got recreated decades later for the price of a movie ticket, which is either a triumph of accessibility or proof that nothing sacred survives contact with a supply chain. There's also the quieter, stranger irony sitting underneath all of it, that a decade defined by paranoia about hidden dangers, about strange government experiments and things lurking just beneath a small town's tidy surface, got repackaged as cosy, comforting, safe enough to fall asleep to. The show is genuinely frightening in parts. The fashion it popularised is not. Somewhere between the screen and the closet, all the dread got filtered out, leaving behind just the denim, the mixtapes, and the specific shade of blue on a bedroom wall, which might be the most 80s trick of all, taking something loud and slightly alarming and turning it, with just enough distance, into something soft. And when the show eventually wrapped its final season, that entire pipeline didn't just switch off. The clothes stayed in people's closets, the aesthetic stayed in people's search history, and thrift stores kept selling every windbreaker they could get their hands on to customers who could describe, scene by scene, exactly which fictional kid had worn something similar first. Which means, somewhere, quietly, a decade got rebranded by a horror show about kids who just wanted their friend back. And honestly, given how the 1980s already looked, this might be the least strange thing that ever happened to it. You spot someone wearing a scrunchy, low-rise jeans and a neon windbreaker all at once, and realise 2 decades have quietly merged into one closet. As Y2K fashion surged back alongside the 80s revival, Gen Z started blending both eras freely, mixing chunky sneakers and butterfly clips with shoulder pads and acid wash, treating decades less like strict categories and more like a shared costume box. The result looks chaotic to anyone who lived through either decade the first time, and somehow still works. To understand how strange this actually is, imagine explaining it to someone standing in a mall in 1999, already committed to their low-rise jeans and their tiny sunglasses, and telling them that in 20-some years, teenagers would pair their exact look with shoulder pads from an entirely different decade, on purpose, as a compliment to both. They would have no context for that sentence. The 80s and the Y2K era weren't neighbours in cultural memory. They were more like 2 ex-roommates who left the apartment for very different reasons and never expected to be filed under the same nostalgic folder. But nostalgia doesn't actually care about neatness. It cares about distance, and once enough time passes, distance flattens everything into the same soft, appealing haze. Part of what caused the collision is simple math nobody was tracking on purpose. The 20-year nostalgia cycle that brought back the 80s was already running when a second, faster cycle caught up to it. Because trends move quicker now than they used to, compressed by algorithms that can resurrect an aesthetic in months instead of decades. By the time Gen Z had fully absorbed shoulder pads and acid wash, the early 2000s were already crossing their own 20-year mark, arriving with low-rise jeans, tiny handbags, and rhinestones just as the 80s revival was hitting its stride. 2 decades that never overlapped in real time ended up overlapping in a teenager's algorithm feed within the same scrolling session. And nobody stopped to ask if that made sense. It just happened, the way weather happens. The result, when you actually look at it, involves genuinely startling combinations. A cropped baby tee from the Y2K playbook gets paired with a boxy 80s blazer with shoulders wide enough to eclipse a doorway. Butterfly clips, a distinctly late 90s and early 2000s accessory, get scattered through a crimped 80s hairstyle that was originally engineered to survive a hurricane. Chunky sneakers built for early 2000s dadcore get worn with acid-wash jeans stiff enough to stand in a corner by themselves. None of these pieces were ever meant to occupy the same outfit, let alone the same decade, and yet, here they are, coexisting the way ingredients in a dish you'd never order separately somehow work when someone brave enough combines them. There's a term that gets thrown around for this kind of blending, remix, mashup, whatever the caption calls it that week, but functionally it's closer to how thrift stores are actually organised. bins don't sort by decade. A rack of second-hand clothing might have a 1986 windbreaker hanging directly next to a 2003 velour tracksuit, with nothing but a shared price tag connecting them. Shoppers who grew up browsing that way, physically or online, simply never learned to think in strict decade boundaries the way older generations do. Generations who lived each era once, in order, and therefore experienced them as separate rooms rather than one long hallway with the doors removed. There's also a comfort angle nobody talks about enough. Y2K fashion tends to run tight, cropped, low-slung, built for a very specific body ideal that dominated early 2000s media. The 80s, for all its excess, actually offered more room, boxy blazers, roomy tracksuits, high-waisted denim that didn't demand a flat stomach to function. Blending the two eras let an entire generation cherry pick the fun, flashy signals of Y2K style, the sparkle, the mini bags, the tiny sunglasses, while borrowing the structural forgiveness of 80s silhouettes, which is either a savvy fashion compromise or the most quietly practical thing anyone has ever done, while also wearing 17 jelly bracelets. Older observers, understandably, find the whole thing a little dizzying. Someone who wore acid wash the first time round and someone who wore butterfly clips the first time round are both watching their respective decades get treated as interchangeable seasoning rather than a complete outfit, and there's a specific kind of whiplash in that. Watching your entire adolescence get remixed into someone else's Tuesday look. But complaining about it does about as much good as complaining about weather patterns. The mashup isn't a mistake to be corrected. It's just what happens when every era in history becomes equally available at the same time, scrollable, searchable, and completely unbothered by the fact that its two halves never actually met. Social media didn't just allow this blending, it actively rewarded it. An outfit built entirely from one clean, coherent decade reads, on a crowded feed, is a little too tidy, a little too easy to categorise and scroll past. An outfit that shouldn't work, that pairs a jelly bracelet with a power blazer and somehow lands anyway, stops the thumb. Algorithms favour friction. The small cognitive hiccup of seeing two things that supposedly don't belong together sitting comfortably in the same photograph. So the mashup isn't just an accident of overlapping nostalgia cycles, it's also a mild form of engagement bait, dressed, quite literally, for attention. Whether anyone involved is thinking about it in those terms, or just reaching for whatever felt right that morning, is genuinely hard to say, and probably varies by the hour. Fashion historians, when asked about all this, tend to shrug in the specific way people shrug when a theory they've held for decades gets complicated by reality. The 20-year cycle assumed each generation would revive one clear predecessor, and then move on, tidy, sequential, predictable. Nobody accounted for a generation with simultaneous access to every previous decade at once, no waiting required, no need to pick a lane. Given that kind of buffet, of course the plate ends up a little overloaded. You would too if history handed you a tray and said, take whatever you want. There's no line behind you, nobody's rushing you, eat as strange a combination as you like. So somewhere out there tonight, a teenager is getting dressed for absolutely nothing in particular. Layering a scrunchie over crimped hair, snapping a low-rise waistband, and zipping up a windbreaker loud enough to be heard from orbit, blending two decades that spent 20 years pretending not to know each other. And if you squint, really squint, it almost looks like the closet finally won the argument that history kept losing. You watch a pop star walk a red carpet in structured shoulders and bold colour blocking and think, wait, haven't I seen this before? Because you absolutely have. From runway shows referencing power suits to musicians borrowing Madonna's lace and crucifix energy, celebrities have spent the last several years quietly, then loudly, pulling 80s silhouettes back into rotation. When the look shows up on a magazine cover, the thrift store bins empty out within the week. There's a particular kind of authority a red carpet photo carries that no thrift hall video can quite match, however many views it gets. A teenager finding a shoulder-padded blazer in a donation bin is a fun discovery. A globally recognised pop star wearing an almost identical silhouette under professional lighting, photographed from 12 angles simultaneously, is a permission slip. It tells an entire audience that the exaggerated shoulder isn't a costume party joke, it's an actual choice a person with unlimited options deliberately made, and that single distinction is often the difference between a trend staying in a niche corner of the internet and exploding into every mall storefront within a season. Fashion houses have been doing this work for longer than casual observers might assume. Designers have referenced power dressing and structured silhouettes on runways for years. Exaggerated shoulders reappearing on catwalks, the way certain chords keep reappearing in pop songs. Familiar enough to feel inevitable, different enough to feel new. When those runway pieces trickle down into red carpet looks, and then into more affordable interpretations at regular stores, the 80s reference gets one more layer of translation, moving from high fashion experiment to something a person could actually wear to a Tuesday meeting, minus perhaps the most extreme shoulder geometry. Musicians have leaned into this even more directly, since so much of the original 80s aesthetic was built by musicians in the first place. A pop star borrowing lace gloves, tousled hair, and a crucifix necklace isn't inventing a new look, they're consciously reaching back toward Madonna's early 80s image and updating it just enough to read as fresh, rather than costume. The layering of religious imagery with rebellious styling, the studied messiness of the hair, the mix of cheap accessories with genuine star power, all of it gets recycled with a wink. An acknowledgement that everyone in the audience knows exactly which decade is being referenced, which somehow makes the homage land even harder than if it were presented as something entirely original. Award show red carpets have become a particularly reliable barometer for this. Bold colour blocking, the kind that once required zero self-consciousness and a genuine disregard for whether colours were supposed to get along, has crept back into formal wear. Actors and singers showing up in combinations that would have looked perfectly at home on a mall walkway in 1987. Structured blazers with dramatically built-up shoulders have reappeared often enough on formal carpets that fashion commentators now treat the silhouette as a recurring character rather than a novelty, something that shows up, gets photographed, gets written about, and quietly nudges the whole cycle forward another notch. And the economic ripple that follows is almost comically fast. A single well-photographed appearance in a distinctly 80s silhouette can send search terms spiking within hours, shoppers hunting for anything resembling the exact cut, the exact colour, the exact combination of boldness and structure they just saw. Resale platforms feel it first, since vintage originals are naturally scarcer than anything mass-produced, and prices on genuine period pieces creep upward every time a celebrity photo makes the rounds. Thrift stores feel it next, shelves that were previously ignored suddenly getting cleared out by shoppers who watched one red carpet recap video too many. It's a strange kind of trickle-down economics, one where the luxury end of the market doesn't create jobs so much as create a run on second-hand blazers. What makes this particular cycle interesting is how self-aware it's become. Nobody involved is pretending these silhouettes are new. Celebrities, stylists and designers openly discuss the decades they're pulling from, treating the 80s less like a discovery and more like a well-known reference book everyone agrees is worth revisiting. That openness changes the flavour of the revival slightly. Less an accident of taste, and more a deliberate, almost curatorial act, picking the loudest, boldest decade in recent memory and repackaging it for an audience primed to appreciate the reference, precisely because it's a reference. There's also something quietly funny about the fact that many of the people photographed in these looks weren't alive for the original moment, borrowing an aesthetic second-hand from photographs and archival footage rather than lived memory, then presenting it back to the public as though it were their own discovery. It isn't dishonest exactly, just a little bit like inheriting your grandmother's jewellery and getting complimented on your excellent taste. The taste was always there, It just needed someone famous enough to put it back on and stand very still while the cameras did the rest. None of this would matter nearly as much without the sheer speed of modern image circulation. In 1985, a bold silhouette on a magazine cover took weeks to filter down into ordinary closets, passed along through department store buyers, sewing patterns, and word of mouth. Now a single red carpet photograph can circle the globe before the celebrity has even made it to the after party, dissected frame by frame, screenshotted, captioned, and turned into a shopping guide before midnight. The 80s took years to build its excess. Its revival can be assembled, apparently, over a long weekend, provided someone famous enough agrees to model the blueprint first. And underneath the glamour sits something almost touching if you squint past the flashbulbs. A decade that was mocked for its excess for the better part of 30 years, reduced to punchlines about big hair and bigger shoulders, has been quietly rehabilitated by the very people whose job is to define what looks expensive and desirable right now. The 1980s didn't need an apology, it just needed enough time and a few well-lit staircases to be taken seriously again. It's worth remembering too that plenty of the original decade's biggest stars are still around to watch all of this happen, some of them still performing, still occasionally photographed in a shoulder pad or two themselves, decades after the style supposedly went extinct. For them, none of this can possibly feel like nostalgia. It's just Tuesday, dressed the way it always was, except now a much younger audience is applauding for reasons that have very little to do with memory and everything to do with simply liking what they see. You look closely and realise the acid wash jacket on that teenager isn't actually from 1985. It's new, deliberately distressed, and paired with something that would have baffled anyone in the Reagan era. This is the heart of it. Gen Z isn't just recreating the 80s, they're remixing it, borrowing silhouettes and colours while ignoring the rules that originally came with them. No perms required, no Aquanet mandatory. It's less a costume party and more a conversation across 40 years, and somehow everyone's still talking. Consider what actually got left behind in the translation. The original decade came with a fairly strict internal logic. Shoulder pads meant something specific in an office, a certain haircut signalled a certain subculture. A designer label on your back pocket announced exactly how much you'd paid and exactly who you were hoping to be seen as. The rules were rigid enough that wearing the wrong combination could genuinely mark you as an outsider at your own school dance. None of that survived the trip to the present. The silhouette did, the shoulder pad did, the neon did, but the social rulebook that once came stapled to every piece of fabric got quietly left behind somewhere around the second decade of the 21st century, and nobody seems to be missing it. What replaced it is something closer to sampling than reproduction, the same way a music producer might lift a 4-second drum break from a decades-old record and build an entirely new song around it, keeping the part that still sounds good and discarding everything the original context demanded. A teenager today might wear a boxy 80s blazer, not because they're trying to signal corporate ambition the way a working girlie or office worker once did, but simply because the shape looks striking next to a pair of chunky sneakers, no political statement required. No memo about breaking into a male-dominated workplace attached. The silhouette got divorced from its original meaning, and in that divorce it became available for absolutely anyone to reinterpret however they liked. This is also, quietly, one of the more sustainable habits a generation obsessed with speed and disposability has ever stumbled into, even if nobody set out with that intention. Buying second-hand instead of fast fashion, keeping garments in circulation for decades instead of landfills, treating old clothing as a resource to be mined rather than a problem to be discarded, all of it lines up conveniently with a broader cultural anxiety about waste and overconsumption. The original decade produced these clothes with zero concern for longevity, assuming they'd be donated, discarded, or forgotten within a few years. 40 years later, those same garments are being celebrated for exactly the durability nobody designed them for, which might be the strangest compliment stiff acid wash denim has ever received. There's a gender fluidity running through the remix too, one the original Decade would have found genuinely startling. Boxy blazers and structured shoulders, once coded almost exclusively for either corporate women's wear or a very specific kind of masculine power dressing, now drift freely across wardrobes without much regard for who originally wore what. A silhouette borrowed from a 1980s power suit shows up on someone who has no interest in corporate anything, worn simply because the shape feels good and the colour says something they once said. The clothes kept their structure. The assumptions about who gets to wear that structure quietly dissolved somewhere along the way, and almost nobody stopped to mourn them. Even the emotional register has shifted. For someone who lived through the actual 1980s, an old windbreaker might trigger a very specific memory, a school hallway, a particular song, an ex-boyfriend who wore something similar. For a teenager encountering the same jacket today, there's no memory attached at all, only aesthetics, only the pleasure of a bold colour and an interesting cut. That's not nostalgia in any traditional sense. Nostalgia requires having lost something you're now recovering. What's happening instead is closer to appreciation without ownership, admiring a decade the way you might admire a painting from a museum you've never visited in person, moved by it without any personal stake in its original context. And that, more than anything else in this whole strange revival, is the real difference between now and then. The 80s belonged to the people who lived it, awkwardly, loudly, one enormous can of hairspray at a time, building an identity out of shoulder pads and neon, because the moment demanded something bold after years of muted, defeated fashion. Gen Z didn't inherit that specific hunger, and they don't need to. They inherited the raw materials instead, the colours, the shapes, the sheer confidence of it all, and built something new out of parts that were never designed to go together in the first place. It isn't a tribute band playing the old songs note for note. It's a completely different band, using the same instruments, writing something the original musicians never would have thought to try. There's a version of this story where that distinction sounds like a loss, where remixing without remembering feels like a shallower, lesser way to engage with the past. But sit with it a little longer, and it starts to look like the opposite, proof that a decade's ideas were strong enough to survive being separated entirely from the people who first believed in them. Plenty of trends die the moment the generation that lived them stops explaining why they mattered. The 80s didn't need the explanation. The shoulder pads argued their own case. The neon spoke for itself. 40 years on, with no one left to lobby on its behalf, the decade is still winning converts purely on the strength of how it looks, which might be the single best review any era of fashion could ever hope to receive. And maybe that's the quiet lesson tucked inside all this scrolling, thrifting and red carpet borrowing, that boldness doesn't actually expire the way trends are supposed to. It just goes dormant, waiting in a donation bin or a costume department or an old photograph for someone with no memory of the original context to stumble across it and think, without any historical baggage attached, that simply looks incredible. Every generation eventually gets discovered by the one that follows it, not because anyone asked to be remembered, but because good ideas about colour and shape and confidence have a way of outlasting the specific decade that invented them. So no, it was never really nostalgia, not in the way that word usually gets used. Wistful, backward-looking, a little sad around the edges. It's closer to inheritance, the kind where you take what was left behind, keep what still works, quietly discard what doesn't, and make it yours without asking permission from anyone who wore it first. The 1980s spent decades being the decade everyone loved to laugh at. Now it's being worn, remixed and thrifted into something entirely its own, 40 years later, by people who never needed to understand the original joke to enjoy wearing the punchline. So the next time you see someone gasp on camera over a neon windbreaker, know that somewhere in 1985, a person folded that same jacket into a donation bag without a second thought, genuinely relieved to be rid of it. They had no idea they were retiring a future headline. They just wanted the closet space back. So that was the 1980s, a decade that looked like someone let colour, plastic, and ambition all fight for control of the same closet, and somehow decided everyone should win. Shoulder pads that could double as furniture, hair that defied both gravity and reason, jeans stiff enough to stand guard by themselves. It was loud, it was excessive, and if you really think about it, it took a strange kind of courage. Nobody in 1985 was quietly blending in. They were teased, tucked, zipped and sprayed into being seen, and there's something oddly sweet about a whole generation deciding that fitting in mattered less than standing out. And now, decades later, their grandchildren are pulling those same windbreakers out of thrift bins, filming it and making it look effortless. Not because they remember any of it, but because somewhere in the churn of fashion cycles and algorithms and old shows about kids on bicycles, the past found its way back around. It's not really nostalgia. It's just proof that boldness never actually goes out of style, it just waits its turn in the back of the closet. So before you drift off tonight, take a small, quiet moment to appreciate your own soft, sensible pyjamas, your comfortable sheets, and the blessed absence of shoulder pads currently pressing into your back. No hairspray fumes tonight. No plastic jelly shoes squeaking against your heels. Just stillness. And maybe the faint, distant hum of a fan. Somewhere out there an old Swatch watch is still ticking in a drawer. A scrunchie is holding someone's hair back right now without a hint of irony. And the 80s, loud, neon, slightly ridiculous, are still quietly teaching us that being a little too much is sometimes exactly enough. Rest well. Let the colours fade to soft grey behind your eyes. Let the hairspray settle. Let the noise of that decade turn into a gentle hum, like a boombox playing far away in another room. You don't need to remember any of it. Just let it carry you gently into sleep.